With this bill, the voice of justice speaks again. It proclaims that fair housing for all human beings who live in this country is now part of the American way of life. Lyndon B. Johnson, 1968. Although housing is a human right, we can all agree that legal discriminations, practices, policies, racial covenants have hindered a whole race of people achieving the successes of the American way of life that Lyndon spoke of. When he signed the bill into action, weeks after Martin Luther King was assassinated, this law that he signed, the bill, was a follow-up to the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which was to also prohibit discrimination in housing. We know the discrimination in housing still haven't ended in 2023. Good morning. Good morning, y'all. Where y'all at? Where everybody at? We're gonna blame the rain this morning, right? But we're gonna allow people to come in again, and make yourself at home if you all wanna spread out, but just get ready to engage. But good morning, everyone. I'm Chalisa Williams, the chair of the City of Raleigh Fair Housing Hearing Board, and I welcome you to our annual conference. I welcome you to the City of Raleigh and Legal Aid, the Fair Housing Project of Legal Aid North Carolina, our combined annual conference, because we couldn't do it without one another. At this time, can I have the board members stand, please? Tolu Adewale, Mary Hall, Wanda Gilbert Coker, I'm sure she's coming, Astrid Taylor, Cassandra Hextall. These are the volunteers of the driving forces behind this board, sacrificing time, knowledge, and education in commitment to our communities, bringing about change and education and fair housing. So today we hope you come to be educated. We have some really good speakers, as you all see, and we're here to be educated, learn, and understand the issues that still plaguing our communities. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over. Welcome, dry off, relax. Lauren Brazil, the co-director and managing attorney of the Fair Housing Project of North Carolina Legal Aid. Thank you.
Good morning. Welcome to the 20th Annual City of Raleigh Fair Housing Community Conference. My name is Lauren Brazil, and I am a co-director and managing attorney of Legal Aid of North Carolina's Fair Housing Project. On behalf of Legal Aid, I want to thank the City of Raleigh, the Raleigh Fair Housing Hearing Board, HUD, partners, and community members who make this event possible each year. I'd also like to introduce the Fair Housing Project staff and recognize their dedication to serving our clients and in furtherance of fair housing. Kelly Clark, Hope Williams, Peter Gilbert, Michael Monse, Jennifer Lozano, and Drea Johnson. Today and this month, we celebrate and commemorate the 55th anniversary of the passage of the Federal Fair Housing Act, one of our most important and crucial civil rights laws. We also celebrate our 20th conference and the 20th anniversary of Legal Aid of North Carolina. And while it is a commemorative time, we must also recognize that there is work to be done and opportunity is upon us. Earlier this week, HUD closed the public comment period on a new proposed rule about affirmatively furthering fair housing. The proposed rule is comprehensive, but those 238 plus pages emphasize the importance of meaningful community engagement. It creates new accountability measures. There is a new enforcement mechanism, and it connects the obligation of state and local governments and recipients of federal funding with other planning and community development. Achieving the goals of affirmatively furthering fair housing will require people from varying backgrounds and perspectives to come together, to listen to each other, and to work together, to not only identify the barriers to fair housing, but to develop strategies to measurably overcome those barriers, right? Quote, to take actions, make investments, and achieve outcomes that remedy segregation, inequities, and discrimination that the Fair Housing Act was designed to address. And so it is an exciting time for fair housing and our communities, and we kick that off today with our conference. A few housekeeping before we get started. This year's theme, as Chalisa mentioned earlier, housing is a human right. We will have two panel sessions with esteemed guest speakers exploring the issues of housing, health, environmental racism and justice, barriers to housing and rentals, and the tenant screening process. There will be a Q&A session at the end of each panel discussion. There are index cards on the tables to submit written questions, so you can feel free to write questions down during the presentations. We will collect them. There are also microphones available if folks want to just ask their question. We are also very honored to have as our keynote speaker today, Yolanda Taylor, the managing partner of the Center for Community Law and Equity. If you don't already know Yolanda, she is a visionary fair housing advocate and leader who has worked directly with and on behalf of communities across the state to affirmatively further fair housing. And Yolanda is going to kick us off this morning with a setting of the stage. So I'm going to ask Yolanda to come up here this morning, and if you need anything, please let us know, but welcome, and we are excited for today's conference. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And I'm going to stay close to the PowerPoint because as things will work out, you know, when you're about to do something big, the devil want to be busy, right? My contact lens tore, so I'm not rude if I don't say hey. I just can't see you right now. All right, and I want to be close to this, Lauren. Can I put my water here? Okay. Well, in order to ground this segment, it's important that we all build a common language. Okay, I could do it. Thank you. All right. So we thought it would be important today, and I don't know if you guys can see both screens here. I know there's some lighting issues, but I'm close enough to define these terms for you. So of course, if we're going to be at a fair housing conference, we need to determine and define what fair housing is. Fair housing means all persons have equal opportunity to be considered for rental units, purchases of property, housing loans, and property insurance. So when you think about fair housing, you're thinking of everyone having these opportunities in any type of rental or home purchase transaction. And that includes loans. And one of the aspects of the fair housing law that I work a lot in, the North Carolina Legal Aid's Fair Housing Project does an amazing job doing fair housing work and representing those who are classified as protective groups. But when I went to Eastern North Carolina, I want to say, when was it? In 2014, I started doing a practice of law called Community Economic Development Law. And so we began looking at what was the end goal of the Fair Housing Act, which was to end segregated living patterns. And so we worked a lot with that other aspect of fair housing, which is the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. So what does it mean to affirmatively further fair housing? It doesn't mean that you're passive. It doesn't mean that you say, oh, look at that discrimination over there. Let me just write that down. It means that you actually take affirmative steps to remove barriers in your community that might be barriers to fair housing. More specifically, it means that it's simply not enough, again, to prohibit housing discrimination, but the federal government and its grantees, and Raleigh and other cities are grantees of the federal government because they receive certain HUD funding. So all of the federal government grantees must assure and do more than note the discrimination that's happening in its jurisdiction, but it must also, in its programs and its activities, achieve the aim goal of fair housing, the end goal of fair housing, which is to end segregated racial living patterns. And again, it's a proactive step, like it's a step out. It's not like a standstill and you're just documenting that there are barriers to housing. You're actually doing something to remove those barriers. And also, in this discussion of fair housing, especially in growing cities like Raleigh, Durham, Charlotte, Harnett County, even Johnson County, even some counties out east are beginning to grow. The topic of urban planning has come up a lot in our conversations. Some of the grassroots housing advocates have found themselves in situations where they have to become planners because you want to be able to make comments regarding certain planning documents. So what is urban planning? Urban planning is a technical and political process that is focused on the development and the design of land use and your surrounding built environment, including air, including water, and the infrastructure passing into and out of urban areas such as transportation, communication, and networks, and all of their accessibility. So urban planning, when you think about that, it's about your built environment that includes all of these things. And how we use your built environment. Another term that that we've had to learn, and a lot of you, I'm assuming if you're here, may have heard of urban renewal. We've heard some good things about urban renewal, and we've heard some bad things about urban renewal. If any of you have read The Color of the Law by Richard Rothstein, it was an eye-opening realization of what, quote-unquote, so-called urban renewal did. Well, urban renewal is a process where privately owned properties within a designated renewal area are purchased or taken by eminent domain, by municipal jurisdiction for redevelopment, or there could be a redevelopment authority too. A lot of cities and towns have a redevelopment arm that can do this. And then it's reconveyed to maybe a private developer, or it could be a public developer who is going to use the land for other uses. In The Color of the Law, we saw that so-called urban renewals disproportionately impacted Black communities, and a lot of communities were demolished and buildings were razed and people were displaced. So a lot of folks have coined this term, Negro removal. It's as early as the 20th century, city governments, backed by federal dollars, as some of you have read in The Color of the Law, demolished hundreds of Black neighborhoods in the name of urban renewal. During the civil rights and Black power eras, the term Negro removal was virtually synonymous with urban renewal. It was commonplace for something like a highway to be built directly through a Black community, and we know that this is still, these occurrences still happen today. So gentrification, a hot word. We all are talking about gentrification. Some people say gentrification is revitalization. I say gentrification is not revitalization. There are two different terms, because I think you can revitalize an area without mass displacement. So let's build this common language. Gentrification is the transformation of a city neighborhood from low value to high value. Gentrification is also viewed as a process of urban development in which a neighborhood or portion of a city develops rapidly in a short period of time, often as a result of urban renewal programs that sometimes lead to Negro removal. This process is often marked by inflated home prices and displacement of a neighborhood's previous residents. And again, some people say that gentrification is a 21st century's version of Negro removal. Opportunity zones. I mean, we all should know what are opportunity zones. I don't know if you've ever heard that term, opportunity zones. Sounds like a great thing. Wow, if this is a distressed community, now we're going to get more amenities. Now we're going to get more investment, because we know that historically, Black communities, BIPOC communities have faced decades of lack of investment, lack of capital, both public and private, and so they lay undeveloped and dilapidated until development comes. Well, under the Trump administration, he passed a particular tax relief act that will give tax write-offs, basically, to developers or investors who wanted to invest in economically distressed areas. So an opportunity zone, again, is an economically distressed community. That means that the people who live there are probably very low wealth, right? And it's determined by looking at the census tract for these various areas. And again, how do you determine what's a opportunity zone? Where I think it was Governor Cooper, I think he was in office at the time that the designation was made. So governors and states, working with the input from local jurisdictions and cities, were able to determine what will be certain opportunity zones. And they had to certify, or these zones were certified by the U.S. Department of Treasury, and the IRS, but under certain conditions, new investments and opportunity zones may be eligible for preferential tax treatment. So that's the attraction, that's the bait to come to an economically distressed area and develop, is that you would get preferential tax treatment. Again, these zones were created by Congress to encourage long-term investments in low-income urban and rural communities around the U.S. Unfortunately, the way that we're seeing this unveil is that there are investors coming to traditionally or historically economically distressed areas, but they aren't building low-income housing. They're building luxury apartments, and they're building high-value commercial mixed-use structures and buildings, and unfortunately, that is leading to the displacement of legacy residents or established residents. Why? Because they're facing an economic shock. Again, these are low-income census tracts. They're beginning to see rapid development that's very high value. And so the value of the land increases, and even if you're a homeowner, you can be displaced if you cannot afford your taxes. You can afford your mortgage, but if that difference in your taxes makes your mortgage unaffordable, you may become housing insecure. But there are 10 census tracts in Raleigh designated as opportunity zones. And these are the designated areas here. Let me get out the light. You can see them here on the map. I'll spell them out here. It's Capitol Boulevard. Well, the 10 are divided amongst 5 areas. The first one is Capitol Boulevard. There's 3 census tracts along Capitol Boulevard that are considered opportunity zones. Then there's one on New Bern Avenue. There's 1 census tract there. Then on Western Boulevard, there's 1 census tract. Southern Gateway, there's looks like there's 3. And in Southeast, it's called the Southeast Special, there's 2 census tracts. So when you look at these opportunity zones, think about what's building in this area called the Southeast Special. Think about what's going to be built in the Southern Gateway, on New Bern Avenue, on Western Boulevard, and on Capitol Boulevard. Okay. And another topic, if you're going to be a housing advocate or someone that's going to advocate for fair housing in your community, then you are going to have to get involved, again, like in urban planning. And if you get involved in urban planning, you're going to have to understand zoning. And what is zoning? Zoning is a method of urban planning in which a municipality or other tier of government divides land into areas called zones, each of which has its own set of regulations for new developments. It tells the proposed developer, this is what you can build here. This area is zoned either for residential. This area is zoned either for business or mixed use. It could be residential and business or commercial, or industry or industrial. They may combine, like I'm explaining here, several compatible activities by use, or in the case of this other form of zoning called form-based zoning, it governs the density, the size, and the shape of allowed buildings, not just their use. So it's not just their use. It can't just be residential. It goes a step further. And I'm talking about form-based zoning. It goes a step further than just use. It talks about, again, the density, the size, and the shape of what can be done there. And then there is zoning codes. Again, local governments use these codes to define what can and cannot be built. The city of Raleigh uses 3 types of base zoning districts: residential districts, mixed-use districts, and special districts. Raleigh's entire jurisdiction is covered by these base districts, and there may only be 1 base district on any parcel. And just one example, special districts. We don't really talk a lot about special districts. I think everybody kind of like understands what a residential district is and what a mixed-use district may be. But a special district means that Raleigh has a set of special districts for areas and uses that require customized regulation. Special districts can address the unique needs of sensitive environmental areas, agricultural areas, or heavy industry areas. Again, If you're going to be a fair housing advocate, you got to get involved in fair housing planning. You know, periodically, usually 3 to 5 years, a jurisdiction may conduct a fair housing planning process. And one of the documents that's central to this planning process is called a comprehensive plan. What is a comprehensive plan? A comprehensive plan is an essential feature for this long-term planning process, right? For cities and counties all over the United States, it's a process for creating a broad-term, long-term vision for future land use. So it's called a comprehensive plan. So think about that as the roadmap, the city's growth, the city's, I don't know, those boards that everyone does at the beginning of the year, a vision board. So a comprehensive plan is almost like a city's or a town's vision board. This is how it wishes to grow, and this is how it wishes to envision how land will be used in the future. A comprehensive plan also contains a map of future land uses for an entire planning jurisdiction, like a city or a county. It addresses all of the physical elements in that area for a long time period, usually for 20 years. But I have seen some comprehensive plans that are like 30 years out. So they're envisioning 30 years ahead of how the city will grow. A comprehensive plan lays the foundation for the zoning codes that we talked about. Okay, so that's something to know, because if you're talking about fair housing, you want to be able to look at the comprehensive plan, because also tied to the comprehensive plan is the land use policies that are embedded in the Uniform Development Ordinance. That's a big document, and the comprehensive plan is too, but it's very interesting. I mean, you may look at it and be like, what? Are they trying to build a, a Harris Teeter here one day? I mean, because sometimes it can be that detailed. Oh, they plan to build condos in downtown one day. I mean, it's all in writing. The plan is in writing. So I tell a lot of community groups that I work with, they already have a plan. So we need to have a plan, because their plan has been developed and it's projected for 30 years out. So what is our plan? So talking again about fair housing planning, what's central to that is a consolidated plan. It's usually a 3 to 5 year plan, and it is a roadmap with comprehensive goals and a coordinated strategies for addressing housing and the community needs. So this is a framework in which the community needs to be involved in. And jurisdictions that receive community development block grant money, home investment partnership money, emergency solution grants, and program and housing opportunities for persons with AIDS, they're required to have a series of stakeholder meetings where they're actually not just listening and being symbolic, but they're actually incorporating some of the comments from the community in this strategy to use this money that is really a flag for low-income communities. And part of the consolidation plan, you may have heard this term, the annual action plan. Every year of the consolidated plan, there's a requirement to have a corresponding annual action plan, which provides a concise summary of the activities and the specific federal and non-federal resources that will be used each year to address what you prioritize in the consolidated plan. And also, the way that there's a reporting system too to HUD is called CAPER. Grantees must report, grantees being cities, counties, jurisdictions that have received the certain HUD dollars up here, like the CDBG money, the Community Development Block Grant money. They must report on their accomplishments and progress towards fulfilling the goals, again, that were stated in the consolidated plan. I'm on time. Someone just keep me abreast of time. Affordable housing. I got 5 minutes? Okay, thank you. So affordable housing, let me know I have 1 minute. So affordable housing, HUD's definition is that, affordable housing is as long as the rent or your mortgage, which includes your principal, interest, and your taxes, and your energy bill, does not exceed 30% of your household's gross monthly income. So that's the broad general definition. If you're all of that, your mortgage or your rent, your taxes, your insurance, your energy costs, if it exceeds over 30% of your household's gross monthly income, you will be considered to be cost burden for housing, meaning that your housing is not affordable based on your income. If all those items total 50% or more of your gross monthly income, then you're considered to be severely cost burdened. So 50% means you're severely cost burdened. 30% means that you are cost burdened and you can't afford your home. And so that's the broad HUD definition, but there's a local definition, and it's based on what's called the area median income. It's a key metric in affordable housing. And I'm going to speed through this, but this document can be found on the City of Raleigh's website, where it breaks down by household size what's considered affordable. Affordable housing is typically 80% of the AMI below. Workforce housing is between the ranges of 80% of the AMI to 120% of the AMI. Low-income housing is typically housing that's at 30% of the AMI. I told you I can't see. How many? Is that one? I see something. What? Is it one? Okay. So equity, we all should know what equity is. Fairness, fair access. You know, there are some objections to this well-known photograph. Some people say there are not women in it. Some people say, you know, there are just black people in it. But the bottom line is, when you think of equity, think of fair access. Okay, equity versus equality. There can be no equality until there's equity. There cannot be housing for everyone unless barriers to fair housing are addressed. Power, what is power? Power is the ability to define reality for yourself and others. Privileges versus oppression. A privilege is, you know, when you benefit for something that you have not earned. You know, you did nothing to earn it. You are part of a group, and that's your privilege because you're simply part of a group. That's why you're benefiting. It's not because of something that you've done or failed to do. Oppression is the systematic targeting of marginalized communities, well, the systematic targeting or marginalization of one group by a more powerful group for the social, economic, and political benefit of that more powerful group. Just another definition of oppression here. Unfortunately, we live in a society where certain groups are assigned value. Some people are assigned a higher value. Some people are assigned a lower value. But these are the things that you want to think about when you're talking about oppression. And I will talk later about reparative justice, but it's about repairing harm. How do we repair harm? I believe that's it. My time is up either way. Allyship, y'all can read that. What does it mean to be an ally? Not just supporting, but standing up and speaking out and using your privilege to support a group that's experiencing oppression. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Astrid Taylor. I am a board member of the Fair Housing Board here in Raleigh, and I just wanted to take this opportunity to invite our first panel to the stage, please. So if I can get Lamisha Whittington and Dexter Herbert. Thank you.
Environmental and not racial. The economic deprivation, social isolation, and inadequate housing and general despair of thousands of Negroes teeming in northern and western ghettos are the ready seeds would give birth to tragic expressions of violence. That was Martin Luther King, quote, August 17th, 1965. I welcome you all to the panel, Access to Healthy Homes and Communities. Again, I'm Chalisa. Nobody desires to be poor, but with the unfortunate systems put in place to blatantly discriminate and hinder the advancement of a whole race of people, we see there is still work to be done. Since King's untimely death in April of 1968, civil rights leaders and national organizations have continued to address racial inequalities and injustices related to education, healthcare, and housing, which have all been embedded in some form of racism. With us today, we have two dynamic leaders. Lamisha Whittington, Principal CEO of Whittington and Stanley Consulting Group, LLC, where her work is prioritized assisting organizations, corporations, foundations, colleges, political campaigns to be catalysts for progress by navigating the challenges of today's equality into their policies, participating in governance opportunities, developing key partnerships, and anticipating social risks. So basically, what she does is make sure that we have a spot. And then we have Dexter Herbert, the Executive Branch Director of Southeast Raleigh YMCA in Raleigh, North Carolina, as you all know, with racial equity at the forefront. Dexter leads this purpose-built Y. So the purpose of this Y was specifically built to focus on addressing intergenerational poverty, focusing on 5 pillars: leadership development, economic opportunity, cradle to career education, mixed income housing, and health and wellness. Again, I welcome you to the panel, Access to Healthy Homes and Communities. We'll have Ms. Lamisha Whittington up first.
All right, can y'all hear me? Testing, testing. Thank you, Chair, for the introduction and very warm welcome. It's an honor to be here, and I'm not sure if Leader and Community Outreach Director Wanda Gilbert-Coker is here, but just want to give her a shout out. Just her invitation and work with Lauren and also our work in community for several years. Just want to give honor where honor is due. And thank you to Attorney Taylor for setting the stage for our discussion today. So, I travel across the U.S. South. North Carolina is my home. I'm an Afro-Indigenous woman. And so when putting together the WISC group, a corporation, as Chair Williams mentioned, we work in the gap to provide the science of exactly how to stop state departments, federal departments, local governments from dumping on Black and brown and low-wealth communities. They claim that racial equity is an ideology, that is a morality only area, that it is about what you feel and what is right or wrong. Therefore, it allows policy to skirt over how exactly to place equity in implementation, right? How do you make environmental justice policy? How do you check off the list? We understand that our communities have been targeted, but how do we quantify that, and then how do we stop it? How do we do responsible economic development? So it's our job at the WISC group, Whittington and Stanley Consulting Group, to provide the science so that we can eliminate the excuse. That's our goal. That's right. So several years ago, I had the honor of being in Mississippi and visiting with elders at Southern Echo, a prolific, powerful Black-led organization that was formed out of SNCC by a former youth SNCC leader, and they are actually the reason that there's fair redistricting. Folks don't know this. I always like to shout them out, that they literally teach their youth how to draw deviation and math by hand with pencils and paper. And when I went, a lot smarter than me. So 15-year-olds were coming up to me saying, "Are you sure you can do the math, Miss Whittington?" I was like, "No, I'm really not." So, really not. But in that process, I was able to sit down with the family of Fannie Lou Hamer, leader Sheree Oates, and her family, who consistently does housing justice work. And so we did a tour around Mississippi, and as we were talking about her family lineage, we were looking at areas that were also high cancer clusters. And why was there high cancer clusters? And her family had been dealing with breast cancer issues, ovarian cysts and cancers, and it was ravaging the community, and it came down to the point was their housing had been built in proximity and on top of landfills, Superfund sites. So the freedom fighter, Fannie Lou Hamer, who had fought vehemently for our progressive policies that we tout today, for feminism and actually moving women's rights today, and actually faced her own health disparities, her family is still facing those health disparities today, right? And the reason I bring up that time, of course, is housing justice, but it was the recognition that the Poor People's Corporation, which was before the Poor People's Campaign, which is why I appreciate what Chair Williams said in grounding Dr. King's statement, is that Dr. King's assassination is what led to on the 7th day, the signing of what we are now celebrating the 55th year, the Fair Housing Act. Without his death, there would have been no signing. Let's put it very plainly, because it was denied by Congress in '66. It was denied again by Congress the following year, and only because the president at the time, Lyndon B. Johnson, wanted to subdue what could be a protest of great magnitude, he swiftly, what they couldn't get done in years, swiftly and just, guess what? Very shortly, '68 passed what is the Fair Housing Act. And during the Poor People's Corporation, which Fannie Lou Hamer was a part of, which we know Harry Belafonte was a philanthropist of, but doesn't get much credit. So there were so many movement from the North and the South and allies alike that they were talking about not just fair housing, but clean housing. That was the purpose of him protesting the sanitation workers, is there was a combination of saying we deserve dignified work, we deserve dignified jobs, paying human fair wages, but we also deserve to breathe in safely and consume safely products that are manufactured at these facilities. And so when we talk about fair housing, it's clean housing, and housing is a human right. Clean air is a human right. Clean water is a human right. Healthy foods is a human right. We have to look at the cumulative impact. So when we do our studies and our science, we always talk about cumulative impact. That's our word. And why is because it's all about breaking down how layered is the burden that has been placed on communities. We don't have the luxury of just choosing fair wages. We don't have the luxury of choosing food insecurity. We don't have the luxury of just choosing hospital closures and the emergency rooms being our primary physicians after we have contracted whatever disease from the housing that we're living in that is dilapidated and old and disaster torn. We choose all of it because it's chosen us through intentional targeting. That is cumulative impact, is looking at the accumulation of pollution, the accumulation of atrocities, and the lack of human rights that has been placed on our communities. But we also look at cumulative impact as the multiple industries that love to develop in our homes. Attorney Taylor mentioned it, gentrification, right? So the way we look at environmental justice and housing, we look at dirty energy. Now, how many folks are familiar with the term global warming, climate change? We've heard these buzzwords, right? Okay, I see a few hands. North Carolina, thanks to Governor Cooper, has made this promise to be a clean energy state, to reduce what they call dirty pollution, dirty energy. What does that mean? It means that, I'm gonna take y'all back for a minute. During the inception of this nation, there were plantation structures that were erected, indigenous land stolen. And on that stolen land, there were plantation models that was created that was at international scale. Now, why is this important? Well, because policies came out of the plantation era, not 20 years ago, not 50 years ago, but hundreds of years ago, when it wasn't just agriculture plantations, there were also manufacturing plantations, but we don't see that in mainstream media. Enslaved people were not just at the agriculture plantation picking and harvesting and planting crops. Well, there were enslaved hands that were also manufacturing those crops. And then there were also enslaved hands that were serving said materials and crops. There were also enslaved hands that was loading up these materials and manufacturing products on ships, because this was an international trade. And so at that time, the land was being extracted from so vastly that it was the first sign of global warming, that the actual extraction of the plantation model was so disastrous to land that it destroyed the topsoil within a mere 50 to 60 years. Topsoil that took thousands of years of cultivation by indigenous hands was destroyed in under 100 years by the toil of slavery. Land that is still unusable today. Hundreds of thousands of acres across the South. Yet somehow the people are supposed to be healed. That's another topic for another time. But when we talk about global warming, we look at the pollution of the manufacturing and the textile plantation. All of these existed during that time, and then that was the land that was used in the Jim Crow era upon emancipation. That was the low property value land. How did property become low value? Well, it was extracted from, it was abused like the people were abused. And so the descendants were left to either remain in these decrepit, decimated, economically deficit areas, or we were chased into areas from massacres and lynchings. Wilmington, 1898, Princeville, when we talk about in giving honor to Rocky Mount and Edgecombe and Nash County, when we talk about these areas, we were either chased into land that was undesirable and unavailable to be used, or we were remaining there as descendants. And then the fences were built around us, similar to borders that was built around communities in the Southwest, similar to the reservations that was built around Native American populations across the nation. It's the similar policies. And so when we look at dirty energy didn't just begin with a policy that was enacted by Al Gore as a discussion point. Absolutely not. It was created as an extraction method to create what we know as the United States. But our land and where we've been living and where our housing is being built on top of is the same land that has been hurt and harmed and not recognized. So, dirty energy very clearly are corporations that create pollution that goes into the air around our neighborhoods at such high volume that it creates cancers, diseases, that is actually creating temperature increases in our communities, urban heat islands, and other impacts. And what we're seeing is Mother Earth is also sick, and that's why climate disasters keep coming. 500-year storms are every year now. Hurricane Flora and Dorian, East Side East, we could keep going. We can go back to Florida. We can go back to Fran. Folks who are from North Carolina have been here that long. Mother Earth is also hurting, and it is hurting our communities in turn because, guess what? Recycling and individual consumerism is not what caught the Gulf of Mexico on fire. Right? Our communities have been recycling. You open up the refrigerator, you may see a Cool Whip container in it. You hope it has whipped cream in it. It may just have some greens. We saw the grease that our elders would put on the back of the stove and reuse that grease. We saw every part of the hog being used to season and fat back and pork rinds. We did every single time. Even sometimes folks did and prayed in religious ceremonies that still use animal portions after they had eaten the meal. Recycling has been a part of the tapestry of our communities. The elders knew it best. The ancestors taught us. So it isn't us that set the Gulf of Mexico on fire. It's the corporations that we are now fighting in our communities. And so this was the plantation to corporation model because we all know folks who have worked in a manufacturing plant or in a poultry facility. I almost did out of high school. So my mom and grandmother said, no, you're going to Raleigh to do this work, and you will work in that plant for your people. But it'll be a different way. And they were right. Giving honor to my grandmother who just recently passed. She's right. I do work in that plant, but on the other side. Protesting for fair wages, human rights, and fair housing. So as Attorney Taylor ground for us urban renewal, what happened is that land that was now depreciated, devalued, and extracted coming out the plantation model and that we were living in these Jim Crow era lines, well, guess what? Heirs' property wasn't eligible for mortgages. We wasn't eligible to actually receive funding to renovate and reconstruct our homes, our areas, or even move. So the degradation of our communities continue to decline year after year after year because intentional either denial, refusal, or just silencing of our communities when we apply for funding from the U.S. Department of Agriculture or when we apply for funding from these other state departments. So then that is what made our communities the ghetto. Isn't that interesting? Right? These thriving middle-class communities, Cameron Village, I want to give honor. I just met Leap Turner, and I want to give honor to the folks that are in this space that come from thriving middle-class freed settlements that makes the landscape of Raleigh, Wake County, Oberlin Village, Method Road. I lived there for 7 years. When we talk about these communities were thriving and rich, and they still made land that was sick, somehow still profitable. The magic in the people, right? Blessed. But because of the degradation and the targeting of the lack of resources, our communities continue to decline, and therefore the property values continue to get lower because there were slums, they were blighted, they were ghettos. And then when we were lynched or massacred or there were bombings, we became refugees in our own land and had to restart again in areas that were now considered low wealth, low value. So middle class, upper class kings, queens, folks who survived slavery were now considered refugees and ghettos, but they don't get that designation, right? No. Instead, it set up an opportunity for redlining. It set up an opportunity for urban renewal programs where there were unfortunate, local leaders that were like, well, wait a minute, let's take these ghettos and these slums and let's urban renewal them, which means we can sell this property to developers and we can create programs and subsidize different tax incentives, and we can then, the loans that were denied the people by the local banks, we'll work with the banks to give the loans to the developers. And that's urban renewal. That's how we quantify racism. When we say discrimination and racism, when we talk about classism, when we talk about low-wealth populations, which include white communities, when we quantify that, we can break it down into formulas. When you do rezoning, redlining to rezoning to redevelopment, it equals racism. Isn't that funny? All R's. Because the redevelopment was, let's take what we already did intentionally, lowering the property value by divesting in this community, then denying them loans to rebuild and to be resilient in the wake of, again, as we know, emancipation. Then we'll offer an opportunity to rezone to allow these density properties and to allow these big high-rises for the developers to come in and to make this community pretty again, and that is exactly what happened, right? Wasn't that we destroyed our communities? Wasn't that we didn't demand or have access to housing, but our ability to have fair housing, clean housing, safe housing, secure housing, legally retained housing down the generations was legally a policy, was simply shifted to shift that paradigm. So, 56% of African Americans, and there's similar percentages for Latinx communities, Asian American communities, but 56%, a recent study found that our community breathes in more particulate matter. That means that pollution I was telling y'all about, right? They call it particulate matter. It means it's the pollution and the actual chemicals like benzene and, when we talk about nitrous oxide, these very lethal contaminants are so fine you can't see them with the naked eye. Our communities breathe in 56% more than any other community because our communities were not only targeted by developers for housing that we couldn't afford, well, before that happened, they targeted us for corporations that were paying us the cheapest in labor. The same corporations that made the most dangerous toxic materials that we had to breathe in, the corporations that don't pay fair housing, that don't offer health insurance or access to, again, living wages. And so when we look in our communities, Black Americans are exposed to more pollution from every type of source. So around our homes is industry, agriculture, all manner of vehicles, and residential sources and restaurant emissions. When we talk about impervious surfaces, and we'll get to that before I begin to wind down, we are saying that our communities, we didn't build these industries around them, they were built around us. Again, what did I say about borders? It's now the borders of industry. It's now the borders of fast food restaurants because we're food insecure because it was zoned. The grocery store was zoned. It's the border of transportation corridors, bus routes, and interstates with noise and air pollution. Is borders of environmental harm. But we see modern day redlining, so what I was telling you in history isn't so much history. It's much more present. We may call it gentrification now, but let me ground again. Redlining was the practice of creating these segregated neighborhoods so that we couldn't access, if we couldn't receive funds to build up our neighborhoods, we also couldn't move into clean neighborhoods because it was redlined access. It was a borderline. So you wouldn't give us funding to rebuild and to renovate, and you also wouldn't give us the funding and the access and the acceptance of our application to move into a new neighborhood. What did you expect? But they tell us asthma is generational. They tell us a genetic disorder, right? When we talk about communities living with disabilities, what do you think is the cause of high rates of asthma? What do you think lead does to children that are in the developmental phase? And we talk about autism, and we talk about the spectrum. We are not being honest in policy. We're not listening to community. When we talk about how are these disorders and these disabilities happening at high risk, or how are they being exacerbated? That is continuing because redlining today we saw in 2020 when corporations were joining the people in protesting against state-sanctioned violence, and they had their banners and their signs and their corporate coloring that went up of Black Lives Matter. At the same time, one of these corporations was denying loan applications for mortgages at some of the same rates that they did historically for Black applicants. Similar rates for Hispanic applicants, similar rates for Asian American applicants. But blacks were at the highest disparity. And this expose didn't happen until 2 years later in 2022. But Black Lives Mattered on paper, but it didn't matter for housing. Well, how does Wells Fargo, not to pick on them, but I'm going to pick on them. Pick on them. I like it. Shame them. Shame the devil. When we talk about Wells Fargo denying loans, Wells Fargo was also behind the scenes of funding and supporting a pipeline going through a Native American reservation, the Dakota Access Pipeline. So housing is now connected to a pipeline that is connected to denying black homeowners, denying Hispanic homeowners, denying Asian homeowners, and then coming for reservations that, again, the border wall was placed around for Native Americans. The same corporations doing the same thing. Now, isn't that interesting? Not so much if we study history. So housing is connected to environmental justice because corporations profit from it. The exploitation, that is. So when we look at fair housing, we come into this and understand that Wells Fargo and different institutions that are responsible for still redlining, now gentrification today, we tracked for years the pre-pandemic housing crisis. It didn't just start, y'all. We know that as housing advocates, right? But it was exacerbated in pandemic. And now we are still fighting for what we now see today, and you'll see the figures up here, pre-pandemic figures. But we are fighting now today to get affordable housing, but to make sure they're not being built on coal ash and other, again, decimated, polluted areas of earth. The pre-pandemic housing led to folks, unfortunately, having to leave their homes and become either renters, either by population, migration, renters because heirs property, again, the home became too unhealthy, unsafe for folks to remain there. Because of climate disasters coming in and displacing community, as communities have to find alternative housing, and that can include renting, and renting also includes paying every month at the hotel. Let's be very honest about alternative housing. This is the landscape of what environmental degradation can do when it is not prioritized and fair and healthy housing. Now, 5 minutes, so I want to run through this. Urban heat islands. This is what happens when you have so much asphalt, no soil, no earth. Gentrification is coming in and building all these high rises. Well, congratulations, you are building a stove. Because the sun, when it beams down on that community and that apartment complex and that affordable housing, here is the impervious surface of concrete. Here is the bus transportation corridor, the bus rapid transit. Here's the university and the interstate, and the sun beams down. There's no soil to absorb it. And so the asphalt becomes its own stove, and it heats up the core temperature of that community. And that single community, that block, it can be that narrow, can increase in temperatures of 3 to 5 and sometimes 10 degrees. And in those communities, they have higher utility bills, energy justice, environmental. Well, why are your energy bills higher? Duke Energy charges the same rate per kilowatts. They don't charge the same rate per urban heat island. So you're paying more because your community is hotter in temperature. Communities have high blood pressure issues in these communities because their blood temperature is literally being elevated by virtually living in a stove. Predisposed condition, right? No, predisposed poverty. So we see these numbers, and you'll be able to see this slide later to really, soak in what I've summarized already of how it can impact even water and fisheries, our natural resources, our biodiversity. And this is an example of an urban heat island that we know is all too familiar, especially in the capital, right? And we can't leave out students. I'm a professor at State, and our students are constantly living in housing that is completely surrounded by impervious surfaces. So what is the health and mental health? We've lost many students this year, unfortunately, NC State, because of mental health. But what is the contributing factors to air pollution, noise pollution, and heat in their housing? So as I wind down, again, you'll be able to see this because I'm running out of time. We did research to prove what kind of truck and transportation emissions were causing ozone levels, contamination, to prove that folks were having increased hospital visits depending on where they lived. We talked about how many trucks and transportation was moving in communities that have more corporations, auto, facilities that are moving in. We have to look at that. CAFOs, animal feeding operations, poultry plants. We look at it all the way through the east. And quantifying that, we were able to come up with an analysis that we're now engaging with the state departments and federal departments to say, this is how you quantify clean housing, healthy housing, and asking who is moving into these communities. So the last thing I'll say, I think we'll talk about solutions, so I'll leave my last slides to just verbally have a conversation later on the panel. But when we talk about today's landscape, we see in Greenville, we see in Chapel Hill, that there is, and this has happened consistently before, but there's this decision point for folks to build housing on contaminated land because of property value, right? It is the same targeting of the plantation model, the same targeting of Jim Crow, it is the same targeting of urban renewal. It is happening in 2023. And we must prioritize fair housing, is clean housing, is environmentally sound housing, and we can do that in policy.
Wow. I'm not even going to get started in that. I'm going to have to get myself together. Thank you so much, Lamisha. Next, we're going to have Dexter Herbert come, and just some reminders. You all can write your questions on the index cards in the middle of the tables, and we'll be collecting them in the question and answer portion. Dexter Herbert, please.
Thank you so much, sister. That was so awesome. I think you woke me up with something right there. That information is always powerful to see it and see it plainly. But let me pause for a second and to center myself in this space. Ubuntu. I am because we are. I see you. When I see you, I can humanize you. We talk about fair housing as a human right. And I think about our children. We are failing our children. We are absolutely failing our children. Everyone in this room, we are failing our children. When they say all children experience trauma, the ACEs study, adverse childhood experiences, all children experience trauma. That's Black, white, Asian, Latinx. All children experience trauma. We are failing our children. And if you are Black in this country, it is even worse. So when I say Que Sierra Angera and greet you in the form of the Maasai warriors, I am asking, and how are the children? And the response that the warriors give each other is, all of the children are well. That means it is peace and harmony amongst our community. And as the seniors in our community, our obligation is to the children. So, as we go to the video, I just want you to be curious. To be curious about what if. What if we showed up like the Maasai warriors for our children? Just be curious, just for a moment.
Among the most accomplished and fabled tribes of Africa, no tribe was considered to have warriors more fearsome or more intelligent than the mighty Maasai. It is perhaps surprising then to learn the traditional greeting that passed between Maasai warriors, and how are the children? It is still the traditional greeting among the Maasai, acknowledging the high value that the Maasai always place on their children's well-being. Even warriors with no children of their own would always give the traditional answer, all the children are well. Meaning, of course, that peace and safety prevail, that the priorities of protecting the young are in place, that Maasai society has not forgotten its reason for being, its proper functions and responsibilities. All the children are well means that life is good. It means that the daily struggles for existence do not preclude proper caring for their young. I wonder how it might affect our consciousness of our own children's welfare if in our culture we took to greeting each other with this daily question, and how are the children? I wonder if we heard that question and passed it along to each other a dozen times a day, if it would begin to make a difference in the reality of how the children are thought of or cared about in our own country. I wonder if every adult among us, parent and non-parent alike, felt an equal weight for the daily care and protection of all children in our communities, in our towns, in our states, and in our country. And I wonder if we could truly say without hesitation, the children are well. Yes, all the children are well.
What does it take for us to say all the children are well? Ms. Whittington just gave us the data and the statistics on our communities, our lived environment. How can our children thrive in those environments? If we do not tell the truth, because I'm not here to make you comfortable, and I think that's a part of the problem. We've been comfortable with the way things are and not doing enough to disrupt the systems that continue to impact us. We know the data. Sometimes I get tired of hearing the data because it repeats itself. How are we changing things? You know what the data does for me? You know what the data reminds me of? That the system is working exactly like it's supposed to. That's what the data reminds me of when we start talking about housing insecurity and our children are sleeping in cars and you expect them to go to school and thrive in an environment where they are not able to be successful. That is a problem, and that is on all of us. If we do not stand in the gaps of inequity and call out the core reason to why these inequities exist, we will continue to put a Band-Aid on an open wound. We will continue to have conferences like this and give you the data and give you the terms why our children are still suffering until we say race and racism is the problem that continues to plague us, because that is foundational to our country. Until we do that, our children will not be well. Until every person in this room takes on that responsibility in your daily life, in the jobs that you have, because we all are gatekeepers in some kind of way. How are we creating space and policy that creates new narratives? Everybody can say, I got a program. I work for the YMCA. We got plenty of programs. But are those programs changing the narrative of our community? Too many of us live in the fish in the lake syndrome. We all know by the data we just heard that the lake is toxic. We are swimming in a toxic lake. But then when that one fish makes it out, we use that one fish as the example and say if that fish made it out, all the fish can make it out. That is part of the problem. And we create programs around that one fish while that lake is still toxic. That is foundational. So how do we disrupt the foundation, y'all? How do we acknowledge that the voice of our children are valuable? Because we sit in this space, and where are the children represented? People say, I'm the voice for the voiceless. But how do we give voice to our children if we're not telling them the truth? We're saying in education, in our education system, we can't talk about race and racism. The data that we heard today, our children should be hearing daily in the classrooms. That way, we build the level of empathy that's needed by those that don't look like kids of color, by those who have advantage, not privilege, but advantage in a system. Because we all can be privileged in some kind of way. But if I have advantage, just because of the color of my skin, I do not have to think about the inequities that kids of color endure every day. We have to create a safe space and a brave space for our children. How many of our kids feel safe when they walk into a school? And that's supposed to be a safe space. How many of our kids feel safe when they walk into a mall? How many of our kids feel safe when they're driving a car and they get pulled over? Our kids don't feel safe, and they grow up to be adults. When our kids grow up to be adults, how can we say we left this system better than we found it? When our kids grow up to be adults and they don't see their voice as valuable, they feel intimidated in the jobs that they work in because people don't acknowledge them as valuable. I do something on purpose all the time. I stand in a room and I want to see how many people are going to acknowledge my existence. Because if you can't acknowledge my existence, I know you are not acknowledging the existence of others. When you don't see our children, they internalize that. They internalize that to a point where they are stressed out with their blood pressure. Kids are experiencing high blood pressure right now. One, because of their built environment, but because of the anxiety that they feel when they step in spaces knowing that they are not safe. Those of us that are not proximate to these inequities don't have the empathy needed in their decision making. You know what they tell our kids? You're the problem. They tell our kids, you're the problem. And our kids internalize that. So if you don't feel like you have any value when you show up, that continues to show up in your life. You're scared to speak up in your job because people are shooting down your ideas, because they've been shooting down your ideas when you were in school, and now you have a job and your ideas are being shut down. That's not a space you can thrive in. Right? When we test our kids to death and say we are focused on proficiency, not growth. When in North Carolina we have an 80-20 model that says in our education system, we're going to focus on 80% proficiency and 20% growth. Who benefits from that? in an education system that wasn't designed for our kids to thrive in a community that wasn't designed for our kids to thrive in. Come on, let's talk about it. And we got to be real about it and stop faking the funk. We got to stop doing that. We got to stop being soft and saying it's DEI. No, it's race. Because DEI don't equal race. Race trumps everything. No pun intended. Race is the intersectionality of everything. It is. When you can define somebody's outcome by their race, that is a real thing, whether they're LGBTQ, whether they're a woman and birth outcomes, right? Black men, kids. You can define what is happening to a person by their race. So let's stop saying race and racism is not a problem. We got to truth tell with our young people. So, how do we get it done? How do we get it done? The first thing I want you to do is get proximate to the inequities. You got to get proximate. You have to get proximate. And once you get proximate, you have to be involved. You have to be involved on a level that says, I'm not an ally anymore, I'm an accomplice. Allyship, they tell you the timetable, they jump in with you, but when you're on fire, they say, oh, he on fire. An accomplice is gonna put the fire out. They willing to get on fire with you. That's what we need. We need people that's gonna build authentic relationship with our community. For our children. Build an authentic relationship. What does that look like? That don't mean you invite me to your church. That doesn't mean that. That means, in my opinion, that you show up without us even asking to an extent and not give voice. Shut up sometime. Because don't think you know what's best for me. And then, once we build that authentic relationship, we have the level of empathy needed in our spheres of influence. When we're writing a policy, it's an empathetic policy. When we're making a decision, it's an empathetic decision. And if we do those four things, that leads to equity. That is how we get there. That is what leads us to equity, y'all. We can no longer sit in a space and show up to awesome conferences like this, but the daggone data still look the same. It cannot look the same anymore. And we have to do it together. People got to understand when you focus on the margins, y'all know who the margins are? The most marginalized in our system. If we focus on the margins, we create a product and a program that benefits everybody. When we focus on the margins, we create something that benefits everybody. So start focusing on the margins. The data is going to tell you who the most marginalized are. Go back to your jobs. Go back to your spheres of influence. Because the government has been one of the most complicit people in this. How we challenge them, how we tell the truth is critically important. And to the people that have advantage, we need you to be an accomplice. Stop thinking about your own power and the power that you feel like you may be giving away. It's share in the power for a better future for our children. Let's stop failing our kids today. When you get on the phone with somebody, tell them that you're not going to fail the kids today. That we are going to be truth tellers, and we're going to walk alongside of our kids and our community so we can see real change. Thank you.
Wow. So, I just want to say that This panel is very dear to me. Someone who has overcome many hurdles that could have contributed to my downfall as an African-American woman coming from the ghetto with the risk that we face, asthma. I was born with a heart murmur, and my mom didn't get to see me until a while after she had me, but it was probably because of the conditions in which we stayed in public housing, lead, mental illnesses rampant in my family. I'm the first high school and college graduate. My daughter is a college graduate, full scholarship. She goes to FAMU, and I had her at 14, so it's just so many things that could have contributed to my downfall because of my community. And I'm just in awe to learn. And even when I look at my community as a kid and I go back home to Newport News, Virginia, redlining, if you know anything about Newport News, Virginia, you know the public housing is all in one area. So crime is horrible. So when we talk about our communities, we talk about thriving communities and healthy homes and access to homes. I wasn't to the 6th grade when I went to the dentist for the first time, and that's because the state took us out of our homes. And when the state take you out of your homes and they put you in a group home, they're gonna do, just like you in the NFL draft, they're gonna do a complete inspection of you to see what needs to be corrected. But they don't come into your communities to give you that opportunity to see what needs to be corrected. But once they take you and you're then considered a statistic, an award of the state, then they see how can we fix you up because you belong to us now.
Right.
So I just have to, like Dexter, reground myself and make sure that I stay focused because it's so many things. And then we look at history, we go back to history, read our history books, and we see that this is still today. We're still dealing with gentrification. We have modern urban renewal going on right now. Right now, we have modern Jim Crow going on right now. And it's an unspoken word. Laws and policies are one thing, but what is a law and policy if it's not being enforced? It's an unspoken word of discrimination, racism, and bias. So with that, I'll go into a couple of questions. Where we at on time? Got some time? Okay. And I just want to ask both. I'll start with you, Lamisha. What would you consider like the impacts of unhealthy homes on our communities, the impacts outside? I know you said, you know, autism, and that's something that I can understand because my family, mental illness and despair, right? But the real impacts of unhealthy homes, because we're still fighting for healthy homes. So what are the impacts and the outcomes? And then I would like for Dexter, you to go on and talk about the impacts of unhealthy homes on the children, on their socialization in spaces and facilities. How does the impact of unhealthy homes affects the children when they're in an education system? I know someone who, they gave me Ritalin because they said I was overstimulated and I was hyperactive, but it was no playgrounds in the communities that I lived in.
Right.
There was no grass. So if you all could just, you know, just give me some and give us some understandings on, you know, the impacts of healthy homes in our communities.
Sure, sure. You know, and also, Chair, I want to give honor to you sharing your story, and I often look at, we tell our story, that is us, in a forum for the benefit of others, and that dehumanizes our experiences because we're having to compartmentalize it's us. And that's trauma. That's PTSD. And then we got to go home and unpack alone, or whoever our safety group is. So I just want to give honor to you for just sharing and trusting us enough to hold you in space, because we don't do that for one another enough. There's so many impacts, and I'll use Eastern North Carolina. Wake County is a very example. You know, I lived at Method Road for nearly 7 years. I actually lived there at the same time Wanda Gilbert Coker lived there, and we were evicted the same 2 months because of development. Whole thing. And, you know, so a long history of just looking at different communities, but I'll look at the East. So we see that the state has a tier designation. The Department of, you know, when we talk about economic commerce, they tier communities based on whether they are economically thriving or the opposite. So if you're a tier 1 county, you are in like the bottom. You are not, you know, you're what you make income per year, the population isn't making enough to actually quantify that they're thriving, middle class, they are a disparate community, right? You also have county health rankings that the Department of Health and Human Services does, where they rank the same, all 100 counties, right? And they say who is definitely in the bottom of being distressed health. Well, tier 1 counties, economically distressed, match, guess what? The most health distressed communities. And so when we look at the housing in that area, we're looking at either heirs property, communities that have been passed down, right? And we see development that has been popping up around them again, creating smog, pollution. We saw that in my city, you know, Hertford County, Northampton County, Halifax County, and Sampson. We all saw that the wood pellet industry. Folks will say, you know, it does bring in jobs. But honey, if you've been bringing in jobs for the past 12 years and we're still economically distressed, what are you bringing? Jobs for who? Because we shouldn't be economically still in disparity, yet the promise of jobs allows us to sacrifice our health because we can put food on the table tonight, but I may die of cancer, and hopefully, I pray, a year, 5 years, 10 years. We scale it because we're given that option, not an option to live or to thrive or to have clean, you know, healthy environments. It's deal with where you're living. We can't give you a loan. We can't give you a mortgage. And the impact is you have to work at this industry that's chosen your home because it's cheap for them. And guess what? The state, as we saw the past couple of years, is trying to make, you know, taxes, corporate taxes, zero. Wait a minute. Corporate taxes are supposed to be the purpose. The incentive is to come to the state, provide jobs for the state, make revenue off of us and whatever their, you know, mass consumerism, their base is, and then they're supposed to pay money back into the state to create economically thriving communities. So you're telling me that the impact is we are still economically in deficit. Corporations are here giving us jobs that don't really pay us anything, and they don't have to pay money back into the tapestry, but we have to pay taxes on everything we buy. Wait a minute. Impact. And then on top of that, the industry isn't legally required to conduct studies to prove whether their actual products cause human and health disparities. PFAS, a chemical contaminant that was created by accident in a lab, was put into consumer goods. It makes everything waterproof. This is waterproof, big on it. Carpets, which is the largest source of exposure for our children, has PFAS actual coating on the carpet. It's in your fast food restaurants. It's in the actual burger wrappers. So when we talk about food insecurity and communities that are matching this, when we talk about unfair housing, they put in restaurants that are fast food that matches the zoning square footage. That's how they get in, y'all. It's a deal. They make a deal. And they target our communities, and McDonald's pop up, not because it's just what they do. It is a concerted, orchestrated effort to say, if you move the grocery store, we'll move in. And then also within that fast food is not just, you know, obesity causing, cardiovascular causing issues of the actual food itself being unhealthy and lack of access to fresh veggies and fruits. Now you have a PFAS chemical in the packaging that's leached into the food that goes into your body, and it is called a forever chemical because your body does not have the properties to break it down. It is not organic. It is human made. So if you are exposed to it, your body cannot produce it and push it out. So what happens? It causes rare cancers. It causes lung and bronchial issues. It causes skin issues. It causes cognitive impairments. And it is also passed down in embryo. So if you are pregnant or expecting, it can be passed to the fetus. So the baby's born with a pre-existing condition. And then it can be passed through the breast milk if you choose to feed, or if you have, you know, that access, because everyone doesn't, right? And sometimes that's an environmental issue. Why? Sometimes it's genetic, sometimes it's what you're exposed to. But now PFAS can be exposed to that child. Where's the studies for that? And they require studies for you to be able to get health effect studies data to actually sue the corporation. Not going to happen. No studies. No proof. Doctors don't even know how to diagnose it. Doctors don't even know how to test for it. And we know the emergency room is not going to be prepared when you show up because it is not clinically provided by the CDC because the corporation wasn't required to prove that they were creating damaging products to begin with. It is a cycle. That is happening in North Carolina. It's global. And that's just one example.
So as we understand the impact of healthy homes, yes, absolutely. And the impact of healthy homes, as you said, what I like to identify is jobs, because I know that we have low-income families and single mothers, single fathers as well, who work, who the impact of their communities, they may have to go out far, so they're out longer days, and the children in these homes are then led to fend for themselves. lead themselves, guide themselves, because their parents are trying to make a living. So I would like, again, for you to give the impact of unhealthy homes on our children or future generations and what that does to them on a social status in facilities and schools and centers.
Oh, yeah. It 100% impacts our kids' social, emotional, and physical. Because if your parents is working, typically you can't go outside, right? So, and if you can't go outside for that reason, or the other reason is your environment is not safe outside, right? So, and then the emotional piece of an unhealthy home, when you show up to school, right? If the lights are out at your house, and we've had that plenty of times where I grew up, our lights would be out, and we had those little Catholic candles all over our house to light it up, right? And that was challenging, going to school and knowing that you don't have electricity at home, and people don't understand like what that does to your psyche when you show up in the classroom and a teacher is trying to get you to participate in class when you're not concerned about what's going on in that classroom. You're concerned about if you're going to have lights when you get home, right? Or when food is scarce in the house and the only thing in your refrigerator is spoiled milk and a box of Arm & Hammer, right? I've been there, right? Where we're eating syrup sandwiches and mayonnaise sandwiches, right? And so the impact of that when you get to school, and back when I was in school, the ladies in the cafeteria actually cooked. So my food wasn't prepackaged that I was getting back then. I was getting, actually, it tasted like a home-cooked meal because of the people that were in that space. And so when you think about that was gonna be the best meal that you got that day, it impacts what you're gonna do, how you're gonna fend for yourself the rest of the day. And so when you start talking about the working poor in our community, that is hard for our kids to show up well in any space that they're in. And then you think about Raleigh and upward mobility, right? If we're one of the best places to live, but if you are born poor in this community, you typically stay poor in this community, and that's a problem.
That's true. And it takes me back to you saying the fish in a toxic lake. So I look at life a little different because I came out of the toxic lake. But when I go home to visit, I still see dead fish. And it doesn't have to be physically. It could be emotionally, spiritually, mentally. Because it's difficult being an adult woman, but you see your parents dealing with mental issues since you could remember. So you still see dead fish in the toxic lake, even though you made it out, even though it's programs around you, created based off of your success.
And I would add,
Please do.
this duality that we have to have about us, because we've been swimming in this toxic lake. Now we got to go survive with folks that have been in this fresh water all of this time, and we have to learn how to navigate their space, right? We got to know how to navigate their system, but also still navigate this toxic lake that we were bred in, and still go to their lake where they never have to visit our lake.
Absolutely. And then they expect us to do therapy, but they won't give opportunity and put therapies in our community.
Amen.
Because healthcare, right? I've been fighting for my mom to get mental illness resources and healthcare. And these are people on Medicaid disability, don't have access to proper psychological care and psychiatric care in the communities of lower incomes. You got to take them way to the mountains. So as a kid, I don't get to see my mother because she's in the mountain for 4 months.
That's right.
And being a kid, you automatically experience that
Absolutely.
post-traumatic stress syndrome by
Absolutely.
growing up in a community where you don't have access and people view you a certain way and you're being policed and not protected.
Right. So now I want to, Lamisha, before we end, we have some minutes left, because I can't help but to talk about unhealthy homes, census tracts, and history of how they keep in these homes in the cycles of rotation of urban renewal. So even if now how people are being displaced and they provide housing in the outskirts where the land is environmentally just ruined, inhabited, how do we get out of the cycle when we're having the same issues?
That's right, that's right. It's such a great question, and I won't say that I'm an expert, and that's why I'm joined by smarter minds of my own, even here today. And so when I look at it, the reason I go environmental, like I'm an Afro-Indigenous woman, arid land, you know, a lot of folks don't tell our history, that we brought ourselves before the transatlantic slave trade. No, then, we don't talk about that. All right, and we actually had, my folks are from the Kingdom of the Happy Land, which was a settlement that was reestablished post-emancipation, and they reestablished it by playing the rules and deeding it so that there was proof and record that we literally had a kingdom. And it is the second kingdom in the United States history ever to exist. The second is the Kingdom of Hawaii. And we had 2 kings and a queen, and most folks don't know that existed in North Carolina. So when we say alternative structures and what we do, I appreciate your perspective on allyship. I actually don't like the word. I actually don't like, and folks are like, what do you mean? Well, because environmental for me levels the playing ground, because what you said, the census and how do we get out of this area, polluted water doesn't stop flowing because it read a census report. And air that is contaminated doesn't turn around because the government says you're about to enter toward a black or brown community. Natural resources does not follow the law of humans. So my area is contaminated first, but it's coming to you next. And so there is a camaraderie ship and an accomplish, I like that, a co-conspiratorship that should be happening, because the resiliency that's within our community is the actual secret to success, because we aren't dead. We are literally survived, and there's no logic. It is. So your policy being built around resiliency is unfortunately a plan to fail. We don't know how to win. And what do I mean how to win? Historically, when we post-emancipation, I look at history because it's how I pattern our wins. We recently, last year, when you say how, there's historic funding that has come to North Carolina, the largest funding in the history of our nation. And it is environmental justice funding, it is IRA investment infrastructure funding, and it is going into different buckets across state departments. And so we looked in the gray area and was able to help a community in Sampson County called the town of Ivanhoe, about 300 people that live in a predominantly black neighborhood. And they didn't have clean water. They actually didn't have access to water at all. It wasn't hooked up. They had wells, and some of the wells and the pipe infrastructure was old, so you had lead and contamination coming through. And they wanted to be hooked up to city water, and they were unincorporated, another form of heirs property in a different way, right? And for 20-something years, they fought for water access into their housing. That is fair housing, right? Water access, being able to actually access water. And so it took us 6 months. We worked with the Department of Water, Division of Water Infrastructure, Democracy Green, Black Alliance, and Conservation Network, and we were able to, in 6 months, get them $13.2 million. And that comes out about $300,000 per person. How do we do it? Because we went in it looking at fair housing and fair and equal, equitable environments, and looked at the policy around what funding is available, and how can we write in the language and understand that, because you have to just, unfortunately, the code switch. And we had to take the language of the community across the railroad track and translate it to gentrification in the grant application. It takes us being the conduit. There's a purpose that we're here. There's a purpose you're in this space. There's a purpose not that we've made it in a seat at the table, burn the seat, bring a bench. That is how we create alternatives. Read the policy, understand what funding is available in the gray areas, and then make it work. See what's retroactive. See how you can get well and pump systems renovated. See how you can get GAC systems at the water treatment operator facility to eliminate boiling water advisories coming through our tap water, which is what happened in North Carolina before Jackson became live on, that they've been dealing with it. North Carolina's dealing with the same thing, y'all. That is alternative structures. And then actually crowdsourcing. We do mutual aid great. $11 billion is contributed annually by African Americans from their personal revenue to go to charitable contributions, organizations, $11 billion revenue. That does not calculate Hispanic contributions. It's gone up 60-something% in the past 10 years, where they literally contribute their direct funding in the absence of equitable funding to nonprofits. They do it themselves. It's called mutual aid. We have to grow our own food, establish our own policies, and stay homogenous before representation of post-emancipation. That's a long conversation. It's a long conversation, Chair, but those are some things.
So I just want to say thank you to our amazing panel, Lamisha Whittington and Dexter Herbert. I appreciate you all, and we can agree that when we look outside and we see gentrification, we see, the kids walking down the streets with the hoodies on. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're a threat. Sometimes they just may not have the self-confidence that was given to them, and they may not have ever been talked up to based on just the traumas of their environments. Thank you, and I'm going to, yes, I did, I wasn't sure what time. So we'll have one question from the audience if someone would like to ask a question. We have some persons, any questions? You can raise your note card or bring the mic. We have one here in the back.
Will these slides and video be available to us, perchance?
Yeah, that's,
You can speak to Lamisha. Can we pass it along? Would you
oh yeah,
like
it's
to pass it
published, so
along?
I'll just send over the link and absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
Any other questions? Anyone? Okay, we got Wah.
Okay. One small statement and one question, if you don't mind. So, Whittington, you mentioned about and also with Yolanda Taylor, you talked about the opportunity zones and intersectionality of the issues. And interestingly, how Capitol Boulevard and New Bern Avenue are part of the opportunity zone, because I've been to the City of Raleigh retreat, which, by the way, is not recorded or streamed or live streamed for that portion, but the Raleigh Police Department reported that Apryl Boulevard and New Bern are the area they consider as hotspots. So that's one other connection with how I feel like not only is a community targeted by private developers with public transit, it's also targeted and cleared out using weapons in the city. That's one statement I want to bring out, just to raise awareness. Second, I want to bring up a question. One thing that frustrates me about the Raleigh City Council and Mayor, old and recently elected, is that when pushing for the city to build low-income housing, because the city needs low-income housing more than anything right now, one common narrative I hear is that they'll say, oh, I talked to the city attorney, I talked to the city manager, or something like that, and they say it's illegal. So how can we push back against this narrative from elected officials, other authorities that claim that they care, but that their hands are somehow tied?
That's such a great question. First, and Wah, so good to see you, and appreciate your activism for the years that you've been in this space. Same with Leader Cawthon, who is in space. If folks are not aware of her advocacy, I suggest you catch up. I suggest you catch up and also support purchasing her book. And so the reason I start there and give an honor to folks in the space that have been doing this work for years in this area and beyond, but especially Wake County. First, I can't begin to speak on behalf of an elected official. I'm not, I want to be very careful of my alternative strategies is saying what, in my experience, and then sometimes my beliefs. So sometimes it's going to be mixed, but I try to use data to keep my bias out of it. So folks can use the data and go from there. What I've seen work, can't speak on what I agree with you, and I agree with you. We've done community workshops together of what we've seen that is inequitable. It is sometimes excuses and scapegoats given in order to allow the same folks who gave donation dollars to be able to buy property at an advantage. And so when we look at politics, campaign financing is a policy issue. The fact that corporations can give campaign donations that allow for elected officials to be more accountable to the corporation than to the people because they're paid. We have to look at dark money and financing, and when we look at our legislature, when we look at gerrymandering, there are barriers to being able to get fair representation, accurate representation, but we have to look at the long game and the short game. The long game is we have to reform our actual policies that allow for funding to go at the matched limit from corporations to politicians. That's why we see politicians who have private investments in privatized prisons. Another conversation for another time. That's also an environmental issue, y'all. Okay? When do you think they've tested their water last? Yeah, we do deep grassroots organizing, try to get testing kits in there, and folks have been put in, of course, unfortunately, silo chambers as a punishment. So that's one, is the state policy that allows for local elected officials and ordinances that allows them to be responsive to corporations. That's what we're fighting. And how you do that is you have to push leverage on the corporation. Somebody told me, very wise, said, the best way to get a corporation to go against its best interest, and that's money, is to embarrass them. Their capital is their reputation. Unfortunately, that's the organizing that we have to do, is we have to get out of, unfortunately, it becomes begging a politician who is not going to be responsible because they're gerrymandered into the space, can't vote them out, or they're paid by corporations, so let's go to the corporation. Let's embarrass them. Let's do it. That's deep grassroots. The other side of it is your LLCs, your corporations. I always encourage folks, nonprofits are not always the way to go in building power. And I say this as someone who has ran a nonprofit for many years, decade, 15 years. Your corporation's still not the only pathway to liberation. Become a consultant, contract yourself in a way that is in relationship with elected officials to where you are the first called upon consultant. That's inside-outside strategy. So that you are not begging to create access to the people, you are the access. And that's your corporation, is to create that access. And so there's a longer conversation. I hope some of that helps to do alternative strategies and power building, just to amplify what y'all are already doing, because you're already doing a lot and moving the pendulum for our people. So thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. So, again, I just would like to just say thank you to our two panelists, Dexter Herbert and Lamisha Whittington, who gave us what we needed. And we are going to transition to a short break. And we'll be back at 11:20. Thank you all. You all can step out, get some water, stretch, stand. It's a lot.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tolu Adewale. I am the Vice Chair of the Fair Housing Hearing Board. Welcome to our second panel of the day, tenant screening. To start with, could I please get a show of hands? Who here in the room is a renter? Who here is a homeowner? Who here is a landlord? Who here is a member, as in a member of a homeowners association, not living in a homeowners association, but actually a member of the HOA board? Of course, I know that we have many housing advocates in the room, so who here is a government, a municipal or government official? And who here knows someone who has been denied housing based on a criminal record? Okay, I did not actually expect that to be the largest category. Expected it to be pretty big, but not quite more than half of the room. Housing applicants face many types of screens, from criminal records to the amount of income, the type of income, and more when they apply for housing. Some screens are carefully calibrated, while others are overly restricted and turn the screens into barriers. Our panelists today are going to discuss how these screens control access to housing. And before I introduce our panelists, I want to ask you all, what do you want to take away from this panel today? After all the presentations and discussions, you'll have more information. But beyond that, please ask yourself how you can commit to one action that will help address these issues. Identify something that you can commit to, just one thing that you can commit to, because everyone can do something that will help to address and alleviate these systemic issues. So I'm honored to introduce our two panelists, Apryl Lewis and Quisha Mallette. Apryl is a Charlotte-based activist with Action NC. She organizes people in her community who face housing barriers every day, and she works hard every day to find ways to help break down and eliminate those barriers. Apryl will talk about tenant screenings, application fees, credit score requirements, eviction history screenings, refusals to accept vouchers, income requirements, that whole bundle of issues, and how the lack of clear guidance to applicants prevents them often from knowing what to expect in advance and the consequences of housing denials. Quisha Mallette is a staff attorney with the North Carolina Justice Center. Her work focuses on the collateral consequences for involvement in the criminal legal system. Involvement includes not just convictions, but even dismissed charges. Any contact with the criminal legal system can leave a person with mountains of debt and collateral consequences that go far beyond the criminal sentence itself. Quick note, during this panel, we will likely discuss some pending legislation. This information is offered for educational purposes only. It does not represent an endorsement by HUD or Legal Aid of North Carolina or any sponsoring entity. So to start us off, we have a video, and then Apryl will begin.
Yep. I thank you, everyone. I thank you for inviting me out today. As he stated, I am an advocate in the community. I pride myself on being authentic and genuine in the community and representative of those people that I work for every single day. Just to build some context around the video, it's not up to me to tell the stories. I allow the people facing these issues to tell the stories. And what I have done is collected a tenant story from Ms. Gail Wells, a 55-year-old disabled senior with a household of 6 individuals that has been looking for housing for the last 3 years. You can go ahead and start
The first one I thought was really different. He made the stipulation whoever bought the house had to leave me here.
Okay.
And the second one did the same thing. So when she came, I thought I was good. So it's like it doesn't really matter who she sell it to. If she had just said that, I'd still be here.
Right.
Although I could take my time, like, without any pressure and go ahead and move. I wanted to try to downsize, change. The neighborhood is changing. And I'm like, I wanted to change, but I still want to stay in this vicinity. I love it so much.
Right.
The area code vicinity.
Okay. So let's move a little bit further ahead. So we have your new private landlord, and she comes and tells you that she wants to sell. And what was that process like? Like, when did she come to you? How long did you have?
She gave me my notice because the lease would have been our renting term would have been up in June.
Of this year?
No, of that year.
Okay, in 2013?
Correct.
Okay.
Which was fine.
Okay.
So it's like, okay, I got 3 months. No big deal because you got 3 months to pack up and find some place and move. That's the first time I ever moved down here. So I had no idea. And everyone, like, I don't see any little for rent signs just shoved on the property. I can go up and down the streets in the neighborhoods that I like, and you see the vacant homes. I don't know how to get in touch with them. Of course, I'm trying to leave little messages in the mailbox or tacked up at the door or something. That didn't work. And that's when they said you have to go through property management. Everybody uses management companies. I don't know anything about a management company. Okay. And that's the problem.
All right, so. Oh, go ahead.
That's part of the problem. Management company, okay, that's one new thing. The voucher, I knew I was safe, secured from my past experiences, no problem.
And when you say voucher, you mean the Section 8 voucher, right?
Correct. Down here, it's a problem.
Why would you say it's a problem? What was the problem that you experienced?
No one, I'd say over 80% of the people, preferably property manager companies, do not like vouchers. I don't know why. Where I come from, everybody's fighting for the voucher. Down here, no one wants to touch anyone with a voucher. Okay, I'll try to be more flexible, understanding. I have nothing. Everything's good. My credit score is good. No kind of records, nothing from the house, from everyone living in my house. Okay, so we could do this, Then they tell me that you have to do an application, $50 minimum per person over 18. It's like, ooh, okay, wait a minute, you're hurting me now.
Because how many people do you have to?
There's 6 of us in the family. Now today, there's 5 of us over 18. Before, it was only 2. So I said, okay, and then one turned 18, so then through the process, so that was another $50. They can go up to $75 a person. Okay, I found a company, rental management company, and they seemed good. They had a lot of properties, and I went through them. They said, okay, I went and looked at 2 of the homes. I said, okay, I can't decide which one. She said, well, pick one, and then we'll give you the application to fill out for it. Okay, I did, and I paid $150 by then. $150 for the applications to go through. In the meantime, I'm like, I gotta come up with, I don't have to do the first month because Section 8 pays the first month. I still have to come up with security deposit, moving fees. I'm like, oh, I didn't want to mess with anybody else, so I told everyone, you guys keep living, doing you, I'll do it. If I stop paying my credit cards, I gotta keep paying the rent, I gotta keep paying the utilities, and we gotta still try to live. But if I stop paying on my credit cards for like 3 months, I should have my security deposit. I called them, let them know you won't be getting a payment for a minimum 3 months. I need 3 months to get this money. They said okay, I thought I was okay. When I put in and sent out for the house, I put the application through, I got the paper back that no, I was not approved. What does that mean? What's wrong? I started arguing with my daughter because she was the only one of age. It's like, what did you do? What do you got on your record? You're hiding something? No, it wasn't her, which caused a big rift because I need her for everything. Rides and understanding paperwork, stuff like that. And then we just got torn apart. And come to find out it was me. My credit, I have bad credit. And it's like, no, I don't. There's nothing wrong with my credit. And I went and looked it up and almost had a heart attack because they were taking $100 a month for me not paying the bill. 3 months, they whacked me. Very good, 100 points a month. Okay, I can't breathe because that was terrible. I'm still trying to build it back up. So I tried to explain it to her. I even told them what I was gonna do in the beginning. Yeah, oh, well, there's nothing we can do now. No, I got the money, I got everything else is right. Now you wanna find my credit. Okay. And I said, well, what about the other house? She said, yeah, you can go and try for the other house. And we'll put a note on it so that they know. So, okay. And I went and gave them another 150. Of course, no, because of my credit. Well, you still got 30 more days to keep using the thing. Why would I keep using it if you're going to keep denying me? You've already denied me 2 houses in a row for the same thing, but when you could see, when I met you, I didn't have this problem. Okay, now I have bad credit. How do you move along when you have one of your do not haves on these applications? I said, I should get credit for something. Whether I paid my credit card or not is irrelevant to living in a place the length of time. You got the good reports from the landlords. No one could say anything. No criminal activities, police record, evictions, none of that, nothing. No, they won't sway. Okay, I'm still going and trying, and it's like I found out through a friend, stop with the not paying of the credit card. There was a program that could help me come up with the security deposit. If my landlord wants to sell because of COVID, I have to get proof from my landlord that she's having problems. Because you want me to go and ask this woman her personal business and give it to you, to give it to someone else to help me? That doesn't even make sense. We've had COVID in the family. And yeah, she did lose jobs, and it's just been a mess. Me, I didn't even go to the hospital. I said, forget it, just let me die at home, I'm done. Just done with the whole thing. The last thing I needed was COVID coming in. I was down anyway. Different companies, I've done a bunch of them. There's some you have to just stroll right past because they refuse to accept the Section 8 vouchers.
How many have you overlooked or just had to
Stroll past?
Yeah.
Still to this day, I can name off 5 right quick.
And it's just because they won't accept the housing voucher.
Right. Well, I guess they went and changed, like it's against the law, because it's like, how do you know?
So again, Ms. Wells is just a small representation of the individuals that I deal with in Mecklenburg County when it's coming with the tenant screening process. As you can hear, this is an individual that doesn't have a background. Of course, now she has credit issues that she's still building from, but again, she's not able to find housing, and she's literally been looking for housing for the last 3 years because she specifically needs a 4-bedroom. And with her voucher, it's at a certain dollar amount, so of course she has to find one in that amount that accepts the voucher. So when we do find one that accepts the voucher, she has the barrier of credit. She has the barrier of being able to afford the application fees that is continuously requested and necessary in order to even have a hope of getting long-term housing. These are barriers that are unnecessary. These are barriers that actually contribute and exacerbate homelessness, especially within Black women. Black women are definitely most at risk of insecure housing, mostly because, again, they have children, gotta go to work, for a daycare, then come into, you have to move. Now you gotta take time off work to go find a home that you're going to hope that you can apply for with the application fees, which in Charlotte, it can range from anywhere from $50 to $75, $80 I have seen. But it doesn't add on the administrative fees, right, to process the application, right? That's another $150 to $250 in Charlotte on top of the application fee that's required to even get a hope to have gainful housing. Doesn't make any sense. On top of it, we have a credit score. Now, we definitely know credit score is important in some means, shape, form, or fashion. However, when it comes to housing, it is not a criteria that is acceptable to say that someone deserves to be housed. Because my credit score is at a 450, 550, 650, that does not mean that I did not deserve to be housed. That is a ridiculous requirement that only bars and actually prioritize individuals that are ideal for whatever community that you're trying to build up. However, housing is a human right. I should not have to have a credit score of over 600 to say that you may give me a place that I barely can afford. It's ridiculous. Add on to the point of the rental market that, of course, is increasing in Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm sure it's all over North Carolina. However, in the 4 bedrooms that she's looking for, it's a minimum of at least $1,700, $1,800, $1,900 for a 4-bedroom house. In Mecklenburg County, that is not in an ideal community. It's in those communities that were spoken about as far as like just not having adequate soil, a community that is thriving, a community full of parks, a community full of enrichment. We're going to the hood and still having to pay $1,700, $1,800, $1,900 for a house that's barely holding on to, that has so many housing code violations that, again, people have evictions because they refuse to pay for a house that they do not feel safe in. So you have an eviction that bars you, because even if you go to court, and I tell people, stand up, go to court to fight back, guess what? Even if they win, that still is a ding on their record, and they're still not able to obtain housing because these searches, these background checks that's done does not take into account that that person could have won a judgment. That person could be actually in an appeal process, and they're fighting a landlord that actually is in violations of several house codes that should have been taken care of before they even moved in. These are issues that people are facing in a tenant screening process that is supposed to pick out the best tenant. Who determines what a best tenant is? Your circumstances. If I'm in a community where I feel I have access to food, a park, my children will be safe, and I can actually afford my housing, I'm pretty sure I'm going to be very, very happy. I'm going to be a very good tenant. I'm going to do what I need to do within my education realm, because not everybody knows how to be a good tenant. That's the problem. Not the screening process. Teach them how to be a good tenant. Instead of adding criminal background, that's a totally different situation that I'm thankful that Ms. Gale does not have to deal with, because imagine her housing, if anyone had a record within her household, this would be even worse. And these are people that have already done their time. It's maybe 10, 15 years. Some people that I have actually dealt with have had a record for over 20 years of a felony, 20 years. And they are still being held against them for saying that they don't deserve to live. It's ridiculous. As far as with the tenant screening process, there are different ways that I feel that you can definitely provide housing that's affordable, that's accessible, especially for those with disability. Because we're also asking people with disabilities that need ADA compliant housing to pay for a house that basically they're going to just stay in and become locked in their home because it's not accessible, they're not able to move about. They're just happy to have a home. And we are too fond of just allowing the status quo to continue with the understanding of, oh, well, they have an eviction, they're a bad person. I have an eviction on my record. It wasn't even my fault. I fought my landlord, and I have an eviction on my record. Does that make me a bad person? No. I'm here fighting for everyone else that deals with the same thing that I deal with. It's unnecessary. A tenant screening process is something that should come through and sit down and have a conversation with this person within housing. These are my issues, and it's sad that each one of these applicants actually give landlords their true issue of what they're dealing with before they even apply. And landlords, property managers, etc. say, well, I won't know until you apply. That is ridiculous. And one tidbit of information, if you apply and you know they have multiple applications on one place, right? If they don't run your application, I know they say it's non-refundable, but you can get your money back. I've gotten money back numerous times because of the issues. If I applied, just like Ms. Gale said, and I had to explain it to her, if you apply, they deny you or they don't run you for something, get your money back. Because why? It's not ADA accessible. Where they wanted to change it to, she couldn't use it. Get your money back. People don't know that. But that is true. Well, no, I'll pass it on.
Okay. Nice to see y'all here. Nice to be here with you. And as you already heard Apryl emphasize, and we know the theme for us being here today is thinking about housing as a human right. And when I see that statement, I understand that to mean that access to safe, adequate housing, and by adequate, thinking about conditions that are livable, conditions in which someone can thrive, conditions that are safe, should not have to be earned and should not be denied. So thinking of it from the notion of safety, our communities are safer when people have access to their basic needs, when their basic needs are met. So that includes access to safe and adequate housing. We know that housing access is a race and class issue here in North Carolina. We know that there are many folks who are facing housing crises, and that's something that we see across the country. And many of our communities, our Black communities, Black and brown communities, see incredible challenges related to being able to maintain safe housing in communities and even just hold on to the communities that we are deeply rooted in. I grew up in Eastern North Carolina in Greenville, but my folks are from Raleigh, and much of my family lives in Raleigh and Southeast Raleigh. And so living here for some time and also being connected with my family, I've witnessed what's happened in these areas that people are talking about, going up New Bern Avenue, going down Raleigh Boulevard, and all the ways that our communities have been impacted. I witnessed that, and I feel that with my relatives and my grandmother that lives probably about 7 minutes from here. I also want to say that as an advocate, I'm speaking to you today from a place of comfort, having not personally experienced the crises of eviction or being unhoused or being discriminated against because of a criminal record. So I can provide a glimpse of the challenges that we see in our state, as well as a glimpse of the actions that could be taken to respond to these housing crises. But as I was humbly reminded of recently, there's so much more that can be understood regarding these challenges and the possible solutions by listening to those who have lived in or have experienced these situations, like Ms. Gale, who we heard in the video earlier. Much like Ms. Gale, I've also seen over the course of a few months my credit score drop hundreds of points. However, I was in a position where, although I was not able to make those payments at that time, I had a financial safety net that I could fall back on. I had a place where I was living that I was not trying to scramble to figure out where I would live and whether or not my application would be accepted. And that's not because I earned that. That's because everyone should have access to the resources that they need to thrive. So I want to illustrate a little more of the problem. We saw the hands raised earlier in the room. It seems like almost everyone in this room knows someone who has been denied housing because of their background check, because they had a conviction or a charge on the record. And if there's anyone in the room that didn't raise their hand, then you know all of us who know someone. There are more than 1.6 million North Carolinians living with a criminal record. In our state, it is important to mention, sort of like Apryl mentioned with the civil record, just like you can see an eviction filing, you can see a charge on someone's criminal record. So even if it resulted in a dismissal or a finding of not guilty or something else, that charge still shows up and people are still discriminated against because of the charge. You also see someone's convictions. So when we think about this number, 1.6 million, 1.7 million, 2 million, that number, it seems to shift and vary and probably grows. We're thinking about around 1 in 4 people in our state, and maybe more. So that means that many of our neighbors, our friends, our family members, maybe us, face the threat or actual discrimination because of these charges or convictions that show up. There are also a number of collateral consequences that there's too many to even name in this session, but they include among them real barriers to housing access. Further, as was mentioned, rising housing costs, the application fees that Ms. Gale mentioned, and all the burdens that get created only to apply and be denied again and again and again. So, want to note that there are policies and practices that are in place now that people are thinking of that are intended to improve housing access for all, that are intending to improve actual housing for all folks, but they must also be inclusive of individuals who are directly impacted by the criminal legal system. And having some measures that can move in the right direction include some model policies and individualized assessments that can help eliminate some of these barriers. I think everyone should see a handout on your table. The Department of Housing and Urban Development announced this week that it'll take some measures to ensure that people are not denied the access to opportunity for public housing or other HUD-affiliated properties because of a criminal record. And it will be issuing new guidance and technical assistance for public housing authorities and those property owners to comply. The most recent HUD guidance has made some steps in the right direction, including limiting automatic exclusions of individuals who have criminal records, and so, except where prohibited by federal law. And arrest records, recognizing that arrest records, sealed and expunged records, older convictions and nonviolent convictions also not be considered where it does not bear on fitness for tenancy. Again, echoing what Apryl has suggested before, when we think about housing as a human right, then we're not thinking about fitness to live and how in a home and be sheltered. However, this is what we are seeing here. Under HUD guidance, I want to note that arrest records are not proof of past misconduct. However, there could be some exceptions, such as pending charges. And also, with the more recent guidance that came out, they're trying to allow reasonable time, with the recent announcement, they noted that they're trying to allow reasonable time and opportunity for someone to provide mitigating factors before a decision is made on their application. And so in this way, being able to show that regardless of a conviction or a charge that shows up, there are all these other circumstances or actions that have been taken that mean that this person is still well positioned to be a tenant or potentially be able to own a property. I will share briefly a call to action from this announcement from HUD Secretary Marcia Fudge. Secretary Fudge says, I invite state and local housing agencies, owners, and property managers to partner with HUD to remove barriers to housing to people with criminal records and support people's successful reentry to the community. Research shows that providing safe and affordable housing and supportive services so that people succeed during reentry makes our communities stronger and safer. So when we're thinking about community safety, we do need to continue to think about how we can invest in, support, and create opportunities for people to be housed safely. So I have just a little bit of time to share some information about the North Carolina Housing Finance Agency and some guidance that they have through their tenant selection policy. The North Carolina Housing Finance Agency monitors properties that receive the federal low-income housing tax credits and other affordable housing programs. And through their policy, they have a matrix for screening individuals who may have criminal records. Through this matrix, there are bars. People cannot be excluded after a certain period of time for nonviolent misdemeanors or felonies. And also there is a period of time for those where folks may be excluded because of violent misdemeanors or felonies. There's also a period of time for individual considerations. There's a lot more in the matrix as well, but those are just a couple of the highlights. So I mentioned earlier mitigating factors. So some things that could be considered and that could be named in advocacy could be some evidence of rehabilitation or evidence of training or education since the point in time, support from community members, support from religious leaders, support from an employer. All this to be considered. If somebody has a record that is 10 years old, that is 20 years old, 30 years old, that should not be a bar. And frankly, data shows that the risk of recidivism after 5 to 7 years and the risk of somebody committing another crime is pretty much unseen. Even more unpopular, but data, is that when someone has been convicted of a violent offense, the likelihood of somebody recommitting another violent offense is also much lower than the likelihood of somebody recommitting a nonviolent offense. And I think when we consider the fact that many of our community members and loved ones experience desperation and have to do what they need to do in order to survive and thrive and take care of themselves and their families, I think there are ways that we can offer more understanding around what people experience. So there are a lot more details around this, what you can see in terms of tenant screening. I also shared a handout from the Fair Housing Project with legal aid. I just will mention very briefly some points around local advocacy and what folks can do. I want to acknowledge first that there's a lot of knowing and expertise in the room. And so the ideas that you have and what you can share is certainly something to build on. Something that I have been passionate about and working in my local community and supporting folks alongside of is advocating for more access to municipal funds. So recognizing that we have a local budget process every year, that as people who are residents in our towns and cities, we can sit in on those meetings. We can make recommendations around how that money is spent. It's our tax dollars. And it's the tax dollars for us, whether we are denied housing or not, whether we have a criminal record or not, it's our tax dollars. And so the local budget process is underway in many places across the state, and final budgets are often decided on as early as June, but it's not too late to talk to your local officials, both in the city and the county, about ways that they can support affordable housing and or reentry housing and with very clear language. Also, very briefly, the American Rescue Plan Act passed in Congress earlier during the pandemic, and through that, there were funds allocated to municipalities across the state and across the country to support initiatives, programs, or infrastructure in response to the pandemic, with an emphasis on serving the most marginalized and impacted by the pandemic. And so, although many counties and cities and towns may say that they have made final determinations on how those funds need to be spent, there are probably a number of millions of dollars that could still be determined in terms of allocations. And they have until 2024 to allocate that money. So that's also something that you could consider when talking to your local officials. They have until 2024 to allocate and 2026 to spend. I'll just mention very briefly, Mecklenburg County, Wake, and Durham. Those are all places that have engaged in municipal projects with ARPA to support access to reentry housing and creating housing where otherwise folks may be denied. And thank you.
Thank you both. So now we're going to engage in some panel discussion, try to get some lively conversation between our panelists and also some audience Q&A. So to start things off, So the Fair Housing Act passed in the wake of the assassination of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., perhaps taking some inspiration from the Christian religious tradition of sin no more, but going further, let he that stole steal no more, instead let him work so that he may give out of his abundance to those who have need. The Fair Housing Act contains a requirement not only to avoid discrimination, but to affirmatively further the goals of the act. But the Fair Housing Act is historic legislation, something grand and almost seemingly abstract, while screening policies can seem mundane, just a quick decision made by busy office staff who will make hundreds of decisions in a day, or maybe working from a screening template that they pulled from a website or a trade industry. So, foundational question, can you connect for us what role do screening policies play in affirmatively furthering fair housing? I see many of my former legal aid colleagues in the room who have litigated these issues who have the answer to this question. So this question is for those who might not be as steeped in the details and the workings of fair housing law. So how can we connect up the idea of affirmatively furthering fair housing with the day-to-day details and implementation of screening policies?
Sure, and I will say I am not a housing attorney, but a policy advocate who looks at housing and thinks about ways that we can mobilize our communities and try to build collective power. And so just thinking about what you said with the Fair Housing Act as historic legislation, something that we should understand is that that didn't happen in a vacuum. And so when we see historic legislation that is moving to try to further our opportunities for our community members and make our lives better, it's because of the work of folks who are engaged, grassroots, who are addressing policymakers, who are doing other efforts to see something like that come forward. I also want to note that when we think about more specifically these screening policies and the role that they can play, is that when we have screening policies that are an automatic bar, create automatic exclusion because of somebody's criminal record or for other reasons, then we see people deal with these barriers that can be insurmountable, and as I mentioned, kind of further create public safety challenges. But when they have individualized determinations that are made for applicants, when and considering these mitigating factors where a charge or a conviction shows up, then that really can make a difference in somebody being able to access housing. Apryl mentioned something earlier briefly around, I believe it was someone who heard from a possible landlord that you submit the application and I'll let you know if you are eligible, to fit for tenancy. In these kinds of instances, being able, having for a landlord actually having an explicit policy around who they, what their barriers are, where they may have automatic exclusions or where they do make individualized determinations, can both save time and money. And I guess just to say that it's very important, I think as many people in the room know, for housing providers to rather than move from a place of individuals, only certain individuals might make good neighbors and others will not, to recognize that there's no real clear way of telling how people might live and be in community with us. And so making those individualized determinations rather than automatically excluding people can make a difference in having a community where people can thrive.
If I add more to it, I'll just simply say I don't believe the screening process in its current state is something that is going to further fair housing in its current state. As a previous property manager myself and a leasing consultant, I intentionally went in when people applied and actually looked at their situation, had conversations with these individuals, actually figure out what they have or what their barriers or what my concern is. And I definitely find with the last property management company that I worked with, I had 100% occupancy. I mean, everybody stayed only because I actually was intentional about my processes. I put people first, and being in a position of offering homes, again, that worked. The tenants valued the process that I allowed other than the application. And especially when they came to me and said, this is what my situation is, let me talk to these other individuals first. Let me not waste your time nor mine and let you know or refer you to someone else that would actually rent to you. That's a real process that's putting housing first for people. In its current state, if you just want to find a way to hinder someone and knowing that you're hindering individuals of color, disabled individuals, women with children, and you keep with these policies, it's not going anywhere. It's just going to give more power to the landlords as we have these bills coming out that we'll talk briefly about, but it's powering landlords. It's not helping tenants. It's hurting us. And on the guise of landlords want money, you're hurting the people that's going to give you the money.
My next question is there any indication that restrictive screening policies actually make people safer? And a related question inspired by something you said, Apryl, the idea of teaching people how to be a good tenant, that hit me because I remember my first apartment, I did not know how to be a good tenant. And also, I think that is deeply in the spirit of the idea of affirmatively furthering, which has to be more than just rules and regulations. It has to be more of a spirit of the law mentality, and that sets people up for success. So I'd love to hear from both of you about whether these restrictive screening policies are actually even working, although some would say they're working the way they're intended to work, but also if you've seen programs that teach people how to be a good tenant, what does that look like?
I'll take this one. So I had to get my Googles last night to even make sure that I'm not coming from just my opinion and there's no data about this. So of course there is no data that shows your screening policies actually are going to show that you're going to have a good tenant. That has nothing to do with anything whatsoever. Actually, being a good landlord will prove that you'll have good tenants because you're a good landlord and you care about them. And when tenants have landlords that care, they treat the property way better. It's open communications because I feel like somebody cares about me. That's number one. As far as the information that I did find, there was a Georgetown Law Technology Review that discussed the screening process and identified so many problematic issues within this screening process. And again, it identifies that it definitely hinders Black and brown communities the most. So again, these policies that I'm hearing is still redlining, discrimination, Jim Crow, because you definitely know that our Black and brown people are having issues, especially coming out of this pandemic, and you have a screening process so that way you can weed through the bad apples, right? But you don't. I've actually seen it to where you thought you had a good tenant, you picked this one, that's the worst person that you could have got. Because you bypassed somebody that had an eviction, that might have low credit, but they were so hungry and needing of that home that they were gonna do anything to stay in it. So again, I have no thought pattern that there's a screening process that will show you or tell you that the person that you're renting to is going to be perfect, ideal tenant, especially if you're a sucky landlord. It doesn't matter, because the majority of landlords right now, they are horrible, okay? Private and corporate, horrible. And that's the issue. That's my answer.
Okay, one more question for me, then we'll open it up to the audience. I lost my place. Well, just in case no one in the audience asks, I want I want people to be able to leave with action steps. So what can an applicant do if they run into these barriers? Just call the leasing office and leave a voice message quoting the HUD regs? What about applicants who are not housing law experts? What can people do? And Apryl, you already mentioned at least one thing that people can ask for the quote-unquote non-refundable feedback, and you can always try to negotiate, and under HUD you might even not even have to negotiate, you might have the right to it, under the FHA I should say. But what can people do when they run into these barriers?
So when I get calls of individuals looking for housing and they tell me what their barriers are, and it's depending on what their challenges is, right? There's no blanket answer for anyone. But most notably, when you find a place, you go look at the place, do your research. Make sure that it is actually a landlord and not a scam, because we have those going on too. When you actually go to the place, you view the place, look at everything, pay attention to every piece of that house, because I guarantee you there's a housing code violation that was covered up that's gonna be a problem later. In the application process, if you have challenges, of course, be upfront with it, but most notably with individuals with disabilities and multiple applications, this is where you get your refund back. Because of the consumer protection, if a disabled individual applies for an apartment, house, whatever, and there's multiple applications. Now, they claim to screen everyone, which they don't. But if you get chosen or someone else gets chosen, but they never ran your application fee or anything whatsoever, and you're disabled, and they don't have another housing, right, that's ADA accessible for you, if I don't apply, you need to get my money back. And you reference fair housing, consumer protections. And once you put that in an email form, email consumer protections, those policies, and who you'll go to, the NC Real Estate Commission, mention that. It's a different attitude when you use those type of terms, especially when you're dealing with landlords, because the Real Estate Commission is the one that really has the power to scare someone up. So again, if you feel like you're discriminated against or application, when they have multiple applications on one property, right, that's the main issue. That's where you have your negotiation of being able to apply those consumer protections to get your money back, because it's not non-refundable, especially if you're not applying it. Or if I apply, somebody else gets approved, I'm not denied, somebody else got approved, give me my money back. That's what you tell them. Unless there's another place that you want to apply for, but if not, give them my money back. And again, when they say, well, we're not refunding it, that's all right. Send a nice email to corporate stating those words and reference NC Real Estate Commission. I want my application fee back. I've gotten it refunded twice. That's that tidbit.
As I mentioned before, before submitting an application, ask what the screening policies are. See if you can get that in writing or something clear that shows what restrictions that they will have in place. Even if you do have a record of charge on your record, that is not something that should be used against you. If you have a conviction on your record and it's outside of that time window, like older than 10 years, outside of 5 to 7 years, some really long period of time, then that's something else that should not be used against you. If you do have the conviction that's more recent, then ask for, and you get a denial, then you can appeal that. You can ask them to reconsider. You can provide mitigating factors up front that I mentioned before. If you are still denied, there could be several options depending on the situation. So you can request a reason for your denial and a copy of the report or documents that were used to deny the application. And you can have 60 days to request a free copy. Also consider the possibility of a fair housing claim. And just thinking about that, even though someone having a criminal record, that is not in itself a protected class. But if two people apply to a property and they have the same or very, very similar criminal records, and the company accepts one applicant, let's say the company accepts one white able-bodied applicant and does not accept the other one, say black disabled applicant, then that could be grounds for a housing discrimination claim under the Fair Housing Act. And so there's maybe points where that intersects. And then also consider eligibility for an expunction that would help to basically destroy somewhat your record. We are actually seeing in the process of moving towards automated expunctions for dismissals. There's been a bit of a journey in the state, but that is something that could be very helpful. And then also request a certificate of relief if not eligible for an expunction, and also have the convictions that qualify. Again, it's basically the court saying that based on the information you provided, even though you have this this criminal record, then I would say that you are someone who could be kind of have that liability in place protected for employment or housing. And then I would say make sure that you go with an advocate like Apryl. Have someone who maybe isn't an attorney who can support you in the process, who can advocate for you and ask the right questions. It makes me think a lot of maybe when you're trying to navigate your own health experience, or navigate the health industry, or try to provide support for a parent or a relative who needs more assistance. Having an advocate makes a lot of difference. Being able to ask the right questions, listen, and witness what someone is experiencing.
I'm going to go rogue and exercise moderator's prerogative and ask the audience a question. One more show of hands. I'm sure everyone's heard of expungements, but who's heard of certificates of relief? Okay, that's more than a few years ago. Still surprisingly, well, not all that surprising, unfortunately, unknown. Okay, so I'm really glad you talked about that, Quisha. It's something that could be really helpful for people. So let's open it up to questions from the audience. I see one in the back. Oh, well, we'll get you a microphone. Maybe a microwave too, I don't know.
I'll just mention while we're getting the mic over that other than these handouts, I do have an electronic kind of resource list that includes some resources around local advocacy, both with the American Rescue Plan Act and budget, and other information about the HUD guidance and the NC Housing Finance Agency, their policy tenant selection plan, and just some other resources that you may find useful, but I'll share it electronically because it's primarily links.
Yes, ma'am.
Good evening. My name is Octavia Rainey, and I used to be chair of the Fair Housing Hearing Board 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. One thing I would like to say to the board, when I was chair of the board, we had 5 members, and we asked the city for enforcement power. Y'all don't have enforcement power. Mm-hmm. We will always come up with a 4-to-4 split. Now, that was 20 years ago. Now, the city used to enforce the Fair Housing Act, and they went farther than that. They had employment discrimination, disabled discrimination, and they had fair housing. What I don't understand about the board, why y'all aren't pushing for y'all fair housing rights. You know, we really need fair housing in this city, and as large as this city is, y'all don't have enforcement power. We have all kinds of problems that y'all should be engaged in, making recommendations on, but you're limited to education. You know what? That's why they put up red light cameras for enforcement. It is time that y'all stop playing around, and y'all need to ask for y'all enforcement powers. Now, you don't have to go to the state. All you need to do is become substantially equivalent. And I don't understand. I don't understand why y'all let the mayor do that. You know, you guys have got to step it up some more. This was 20 years ago, and we always got a 4-4 split. We always. So I'm just saying, it's time for action. It really is, because we need fair housing in the city of Raleigh. And the state, they have to work all over the state of North Carolina. So we need to relieve them of that burden in the city of Raleigh. And we need to take care of business. And that is what we are not doing.
Thank you. Any additional comments and questions?
Good day, everyone. My name is Audra Richards, and I don't have a question, but I would like to share my experience. I'm a social worker with Wake County, and we service the homeless population, find housing for them, and provide them continued support, ongoing support. That support don't ever go away. We continue until either the individual decides to don't accept our services or move out of our program. So this experience, one of my clients requested to move. She went through the process, alert the landlord. We were looking for housing. She had an opportunity, and I'm not going to call names with this property, nor the landlord. She had an opportunity to be accepted into this new brand property. She has 4 children under the age of 10, single mother. Everything went well. The background check went well. Then the rental history. It was unbelievable that I lost sleep over this case. The landlord provided a very poor rental history. And I could not understand why, because that was not true. She lied. If I am providing housing, visits to this individual, the landlord has the opportunity to express her concerns based on whatever the client has been doing. And for the 4 years that I have serviced the client and worked with the landlord, that was not the case. She said the client destroyed the property. Why were you renting for her for 4 years? That was not true. The children were disrespectful. She spits and she fights. The landlord that she was looking into getting accepted to, they decided not to rent to her. They believed that previous landlord. I fought very hard to explain to them that was not true. She was lying. We do have this landlord still working with us because we have a lot of clients that we serve is still being housed. But just to share my experience, for the 14 years I've been working with Wake County with that population, it really disturbed me. And I just wanted to share. It is wrong. The landlord has that right to just give these false rental history when the worker who is constantly, visiting the client, engaging with the landlord, every year is recertification time, every year is inspection, and she never brought that as a concern. So it was just to hinder this mother and her children. But successfully, she was housed. Thank you.
Could I just mention, just want to briefly mention, because we didn't quite get to it today, but just as you talked about the ways that landlord kind of had the authority to have such a harmful impact on your client's life, we are seeing, as we're seeing in so many different places, legislation currently in North Carolina that's being proposed. House Bill 551, also Senate Bill 533, that's a companion bill. Just briefly, it would allow landlords to charge tenants for reasonable attorney fees if the tenant appeals their conviction. It prohibits local governments from protecting people against source of income discrimination. It would allow landlords to sue tenants if the landlord thinks that the tenant lied about needing a service animal. And there's nothing in the bill that addresses the growing problems and barriers currently facing tenants. There's a lot more that could be said about this legislation, but just to bring it to your awareness, as there are so many things that we have to consider in terms of actions that are happening in our state government.
And I just want to attest and speak to you. I understand your plight when you were dealing with that family and hearing the stories and knowing firsthand, because you're inside of these families' lives, that landlords have an unfair advantage over housing Black and brown families. And that's period. And what we just heard here with this HB 551, this is just an unnecessary example of how landlords can actually extract more money off people that are already hurting, and everyone's forgetting we're still in a pandemic. And the moral compass I was hoping to come from the pandemic and the strife that everyone experienced is still pushing forward this amount of greed, and housing greed and corporate greed on the guys that I want to make sure that I can take care of my family, or I want to keep my property housed. In my opinion, if you're in the housing industry, you have a profit and a loss. If you make a loss, you write it off, but you still get a benefit. Tenants don't have that same right. If they lose big. And it's terrible that individuals and advocates have to deal with that, and knowing firsthand that the stigma that is put on people that look like me, it's ridiculous. And it was caused by people that don't look like me. And we don't address that, but that's real. And the state of housing is only gonna get worse if we wanna dance and tiptoe around what the issues are. You want money? Fine. People wanna be housed. We need to meet in the middle.
While I'm seeing some questions, one more and then I will send us to lunch. I don't think my moderator's authority extends far enough to hold you all from your food. So please.
My question is relating to housing for seniors. Are there any particular laws and regulations as it relates to housing for seniors?
It depends on what housing they live in. So if they're in an assisted living facility, that's a little bit different. If they're in a senior home, normally it's going to be guided by HUD, normally. So those practices, they would actually have to go through HUD for any type of protections, organizings, et cetera. I work with seniors extensively. That's our conversations that we have. But it really depends on what type of housing that they're in.
Well, I know of a senior that is currently in a house.
Fair market, is she subsidized, Section 8 voucher?
Not subsidized.
Okay.
It's not subsidized.
Okay.
But the property manager is requiring her to pay her rent. She's never paid her rent any other way besides giving him the money, the check. But now he's requesting that she go online.
The portal.
And she's a senior, and her account has been taken advantage of at least 3 times. And she doesn't want to pay that way. She wants to pay him the way she paid him before, but he's demanding that she pays online. So how can, anything done about that?
I have to be mindful because I'm not an attorney. And in a situation like this, I do have those issues that come. It's unfortunate that, again, it's a form of discrimination. Not all my seniors know how to use a portal. They don't feel comfortable using that. And it is a form of discrimination that I have to pay this way and I don't know how, and they don't feel uncomfortable. Unfortunately, that is where I would have to refer back to an attorney because, again, depending on what's happening, they may have some type of legal something. Again, I'm not the attorney for that one. Me being an advocate, what I would simply do in my position, I'm gonna go to that senior's house, we're gonna have a conversation, I'm gonna show her the portal, I'm gonna make her feel as comfortable as possible because unfortunately, this is the only way they're gonna accept their rent. And I know there's some legal things as far as when a landlord does not accept your rent, so that's why I'm trying to stay away from that one because I'm not there. But again, as an advocate, I'm gonna go to her house, We're gonna go through, I'm gonna answer any questions that she actually has to make her feel comfortable, have a conversation with the property management so that way he can understand what the discrimination is basically, because it is a form of discrimination because you're technologically challenged. But that's where, as an advocate, that's what I would have to do. As far as legal, gotta leave it to the attorneys.
Thank you.
Okay. And with that, I will, one more.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon. My name is William Twitty, and just want to say thanks for the conference today. Very informative. I just want to follow up what Ms. Rainey said, just for clarification. If the board gets in, I think she called it enforcement power, what benefit would a renter have if the board gets that? Because I don't really understand what the benefit would be for the renter. If the Fair Housing Board gets enforcement power, how would that benefit the resident and me being a renter in Raleigh, North Carolina? That's my question.
Unless one of you want to answer, I'm happy to answer. Okay, so when a local jurisdiction becomes a substantially equivalent, when they have a substantially equivalent fair housing ordinance, something that is substantially similar to the Federal Fair Housing Act, HUD goes through a process of reviewing the ordinances and determining whether they are substantially equivalent. If HUD determines that it is substantially equivalent, what it means for a renter is that there is a creation of a local entity, a local agency that is authorized to accept HUD complaints, fair housing complaints. They are authorized to investigate those complaints and attempt to resolve them. So it means that there are local people here that would be authorized to do what the North Carolina Human Relations Commission does or what the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Community Relations does. I'm sorry. We are scheduled.
All right, thank you all for your questions. And with that, I will send us to lunch, and then we will come back for the presentations of awards and the keynote. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. If I can just get your attention for 1 second, you all can finish eating as we move forward with the agenda. Thank y'all. So we're going to take this portion of the conference to recognize leaders as well as individuals in the community that we would like to reference. We will be presenting the Raleigh Fair Housing Hearing Board Leadership Award. And this amazing mother, wife, grandma, I say grandma because, you know, she's fly, and she's fly in her advocacy, always dressed the part, which I appreciate.
Okay.
But she needs no introduction. Placing her all hands in type of advocacy and action, we understand why we're celebrating her today. Our past chair of the City of Raleigh Fair Housing Hearing Board, someone very special to me, Sandra Collins, if you could come up. Yes, yes, please give her a round of applause, everybody. Ms. Sandra Collins is the Senior Vice President, Mortgage Community Outreach person at North State Bank. And as I said, our past chair. And we just want to recognize her for her leadership in all of the many capacities she served, but specifically for the leadership in fair housing, the things that we've got accomplished under your leadership. We appreciate you, we honor you, and we thank you today. Thank you for being here, and just thank you for your service. So we're going to present her the award, and this award is presented by the Fair Housing Raleigh Hearing Board in recognition of outstanding contributions in service to fair housing. So. Yes, absolutely. Can you get a picture of us? And then we will be turning the mic over to Legal Aid, Fair Housing Project, Legal Aid, North Carolina.
I'm just gonna.
Yeah. Yes, Sandra, before we turn the mic over, I'm sorry.
That's okay, I didn't need the mic to say thank you. No, but thank you very much. And I did have the honor of serving with these wonderful people for 6 years. They kicked me off last year. But it was such an honor. You know, my passion is the community, fair housing, affordable housing. You know, through my job, my main focus is permanent housing. So I do work with a team that we help people purchase homes, and we utilize all of the down payment assistance funding, whether it's through the city, which is now $30,000 and $50,000. Wake County gives $50,000. CPLP, which is through the state of North Carolina, give $50,000. And there's other programs that give money, and you can stack them. We did a closing recently, and a young man got $123,000 towards the purchase of his home. So housing, fair housing, affordable housing, whether you're leasing, renting, and I'm really all about permanent housing and ownership. But I'll help in any capacity that I can. But thank you very much. I love you guys. I miss you guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra, and for the service to the City of Raleigh's Fair Housing Hearing Board. Good afternoon. I have the privilege today of presenting the Stella J. Adams Fair Housing Advocate Award. This award is presented in honor of Stella Adams, a longtime and fierce fair housing advocate. Her name is synonymous with all things fair housing. The very existence of Legal Aid's Fair Housing Project is because of Stella's fair housing work throughout North Carolina, leading the Fair Housing Center and setting the foundation upon which our work has been based. This year, the Stella J. Adams Fair Housing Advocate Award is presented to William and Phyllis Harris. In 2017, Legal Aid began representing the Harris family. They are an elderly Black American couple who lived in Pitt County. The case came into Legal Aid as what's known as a 50C case, meaning they were trying to get a civil protective order and they needed help. They were seeking an order to protect them from their white neighbor. Mr. Gerkins was their neighbor who was harassing them because of their race, repeatedly calling them racial slurs, threatening them harm, and really terrorizing them over a 12-month period. Mr. Gerkins' aunt owned the property, and she had a management company manage the property. The Harrises repeatedly tried to get help. They went to the civil courts. They went to the criminal courts. They went to the property management company. They went to the police for help. And no one was able to actually help them. They made their complaints known. They sought help. And the owner and the management company tried to evict them. And when that eviction was not successful, they decided not to renew the Harris' lease. The Harrises decided to pursue the fair housing claims against their neighbor, the harasser, his aunt, the owner of the property, and the management company and the manager. In 2019, they filed a civil complaint in the Federal District Court for the Eastern District of North Carolina. Legal Aid and a private law firm represented the Harrises in this lawsuit. Legal Aid conducted an investigation of the neighbor and of the owner of the property and the management company. And that investigation revealed other Black American tenants who had been similarly harassed and threatened and terrorized. Through Legal Aid, the Harrises contacted the United States Department of Justice about the pattern and practice of housing discrimination and race harassment at the property. In 2020, in a criminal action brought by the United States Department of Justice, Mr. Gerkens pled guilty to 1 count of criminal interference with the Fair Housing Act and was sentenced to 28 months in federal prison. Almost 5 years from when the race harassment began, the Harrises settled their civil case against all the named defendants through a series of 3 different consent decrees for a total of $500,000 in damages, costs, and attorney's fees, as well as for providing extensive injunctive relief. William and Phyllis Harris exemplify the spirit of Stella Adams in both their pursuit of justice for themselves and for others, and in their struggle to shine a light on the injustices that still persist across North Carolina. Throughout their journey, the Harrises displayed courage, tremendous courage, resolve, grace, and empathy. For their efforts to make a fairer North Carolina, we present them with the 2023 Stella J. Adams Award. They were unable to travel to Raleigh today. However, 2 of their attorneys, Kelly Clark, a co-director of the Fair Housing Project, and Yolanda Meacham, managing attorney of Legal Aid's Wilson office, visited the Harrises last week to present them with their award. And we have a short video of the Harrises receiving their award to share.
Today, Yolanda Meacham and I are here to present the Stella J. Adams Award to William and Phyllis Harris. And Stella Adams, for y'all in the fair housing world know, she is a fierce advocate. She is a legend. And she hails from Durham, North Carolina, so she's one of our own. And years ago, she started the first fair housing center in North Carolina.
Mr. and Mrs. Harris, we know no more deserving clients than you to receive this most prestigious award, the 2023 Stella J. Adams Fair Housing Advocate Award. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And now I'm going to turn over the microphone to Tolu, who will set us up for our next award presentation. Thank you.
For all of the complex and long-standing challenges facing North Carolinians seeking access to fair housing, the state is actually lucky in some ways to have a network of committed legal professionals and social workers and non-legal service providers, including but not even close to being limited to the Pro Bono Resource Council, Pisgah Legal Services, Disability Rights of North Carolina, and in my humble opinion, as a former employee of the organization, a major pillar of this network is Legal Aid of North Carolina. The 4th largest law firm in the state, helping tens of thousands of people per year, staffed by dedicated attorneys, administrators, paralegals and paraprofessionals and social workers. In not just my opinion, Legal Aid is lucky to be led by our next presenter, Ashley Campbell. Ashley started her career at Legal Aid, but has spanned out and has done too many things to list here. She's a nationally recognized trial attorney. This is not the tip of the iceberg. Nationally recognized trial attorney, past president of the Wake County Bar Association, a member of the Equal Access to Justice Commission, and instead of making time to talk about more of what she's done, I want to explain how I know Ashley. Because one of the things Ashley did is found the Blanchard Community Law Clinic of Campbell Law School, which is a clinic that teaches law students practical lawyering skills by having them provide free legal services to the same client population that Legal Aid serves. So Ashley and I both started our careers at Legal Aid, but we've never worked there at the same time. In fact, she hired me away from Legal Aid, and in the time we worked together at the Blanchard Clinic, I knew her to be a creative builder of partnerships, statewide, with governmental agencies and other non-governmental agencies. and a leader with a vision and the administrative ability to implement it. So I guess it's not at all surprising and totally fair play that Legal Aid turned around and hired her away from the clinic. But I couldn't be happier for Ashley and for Legal Aid, and so it's my honor to introduce Ashley Campbell.
Good afternoon. So happy to be here with all of you today, and particularly to be able to present the Jeffrey Dillman Fair Housing Advocate Award to Yolanda Taylor. This award is presented in the memory of the late Jeff Dillman. Now, I had not met Jeff personally before I came back to Legal Aid, but I have heard from so many of you about him and about the impact that he made on your lives. Jeff dedicated his career to the pursuit of social justice, civil rights, and fair housing for all, and tirelessly served our clients and communities as the co-director and managing attorney of the Fair Housing Project for over a decade. He was a longtime partner and supporter of the Raleigh Fair Housing Board, and he worked closely to host this annual conference and to expand fair housing education and enforcement in Raleigh and across the Triangle. Now, Jeff also knew Yolanda and greatly admired her and her work and valued their friendship. He would often say that Yolanda had convinced him that one of the best tools to make the biggest advances in fair housing work was through community lawyering. You can't have effective change if you don't listen to the people who are most affected by that change. This year, we present the award to Yolanda because Yolanda is a fierce and passionate longtime legal services, fair housing, and social justice advocate and attorney. Throughout her career, she has spent the last decades working and fighting to improve the lives of North Carolinians, particularly those in eastern North Carolina and in the Triangle. In 2020, she was recognized for her role in leading the Legal Aid Wilson Office's racial justice equity work as part of the Transforming Rocky Mount group. Her career is dedicated to serving low-income North Carolinians and working with and on behalf of communities to enforce our fair housing laws. It is my honor to recognize her leadership and her innovation, and to add to her long list of accolades, which include, among others, being named 2019 Leader in the Law by Lawyers Weekly magazine, being the recipient of the Davis Award for Public Service by the North Carolina Association of Women Attorneys, and the Raleigh Apex NAACP for her community work by awarding her in memory of her colleague and friend, the Jeff Dillman Fair Housing Advocate Award. Congratulations, Yolanda.
I'm glad that I was given like a little advance notice because of who this award is named after. It is named after a dear friend, Jeffrey Dillman. In acceptance of this award, I guess I just want to say something about Jeff. He is the true definition of an ally. And I made my definition of an ally into the definition of an accomplice because Jeff was definitely someone from a privileged social identity group who stood up and supported me during some times when I needed support, when I needed to validate the work that I was doing around community lawyering and community economic development law. And he also had a personal commitment to fighting oppression and prejudice and bias. He was willing to educate himself about the different isms and experiences of other groups, He challenged, I believe, his own discomfort, his own prejudices, and his own biases, even though I never saw a prejudice bone in Jeff. He took action to create interpersonal, I feel, societal and institutions of change through his leadership of Legal Aid of North Carolina's Fair Housing Project. And again, he spoke up and he engaged in difficult discussions. So again, this is my deepest and most humble honor to be awarded an award that's named after Jeffrey Dillman. Thank you to the Fair Housing Hearing Board and to Legal Aid of North Carolina Fair Housing Project. Thank you. Did I go?
You might want to sit because I have a lot to say. Hello, everyone. I'm Kelly Clark, co-director of the Fair Housing Project with Lauren, and I am so excited to be here. And I'm going to join in on the Yolanda train right now and talking about her and all of her accomplishments and her inspiration, the inspirational person that she is. So I'm here to introduce Yolanda as our keynote speaker today. And yes. Also, so inspired, and I feel like many of you are as well, by our incredible panelists today. Thank you all very much. As well as inspired by you all showing up today. I mean, this is our first, right, the City of Raleigh, our first conference after COVID being in person. So this has been just the energy here and just the questions. Thank you all. Thank you all very much, and for all the work that you do in the furtherance of fair housing. And for those of you, I did speak with some of you, this is your first time at a conference doing fair housing. Thank you for showing up, and you came to the right place to learn more about fair housing. At the Fair Housing Project, we have had the privilege to speak with dozens of stakeholders across the communities, across the state of North Carolina about fair housing, where we are, and what work must we do. The work must continue, and we've achieved some things, but we have a long way to go still. And as part of those stakeholders, we've talked with social workers who help people get into housing and the barriers that they see that their clients face every day. We've also spoken with community advocates and activists and their work in trying to eliminate the barriers to equal housing and equal opportunities. We've spoken with real estate professionals who are confronting and trying to tackle appraisal bias in their profession. And also we've spoken with government as well as housing providers and landlords. But some of the most powerful voices that we hear from are those that are most affected by what we say the impediments to fair housing. And that even in experiencing housing discrimination, they are the ones trying to craft solutions, how we can tackle, how we can overcome these obstacles. When I think of the advocates and attorneys who have pioneered this work in North Carolina, who have consistently helped center the community in identifying impediments to fair housing, I can think of only one person right now. I'm gonna get choked up. And that person is Yolanda Taylor, our keynote speaker today. Yolanda is an equity leader and expert in a broad areas of issues and laws of disaster relief, housing justice, affordable housing, fair housing, gentrification, equitable development. In her own words, Yolanda is a social justice lawyer, otherwise known as the community lawyer, of those on Instagram, right? And if you don't follow Yolanda on Instagram, please do. And being the equity leader that Yolanda is came by no accident or chance. Yolanda, I know, believes that God has gotten her where she is today and being the leader that she is and her love of fair housing. But this awareness of inequity came at an early age. Yolanda shared with me, and what we saw today, there's these parallels are falling, or what you can see growing up in East Wilson, in a predominantly Black community, She remembered as a young child, late at night, hearing the rumblings of loud trucks coming back and forth in the community because the trucking company was right across the street from her home. Knew that wasn't right. And then later at Legal Aid, understanding that her community was zoned differently from other communities, and that difference was intentional. We saw that in the first panel about the trucking pollution and so forth, where that is predominantly in communities of color. Yolanda is currently the managing attorney at the Center for Community Law and Equity. She has a multidisciplinary law practice in the areas of all things housing, fair housing, community economic development law, land use and zoning, and nonprofit law. But prior to forming her law firm, we were very lucky at Legal Aid of North Carolina for her to be the managing attorney for 13 years, where she provided services to individuals and families experiencing poverty. And before that, that's where I started working with Yolanda, was in the Raleigh office under the leadership of Victor Boone. And then before that, she was also back in the Wilson office as a staff attorney. And what Yolanda has shared is that at her time at Legal Aid, representing clients, which was a love of hers, right, that she saw it as a revolving door. Because until those issues that are deeply rooted in the community are addressed, deeply entrenched in racism, classism, it's going to be this revolving door. She said this was an epiphany of sorts that she shared with Jeff, and that I think was a big motivator for her to continue where she is today. Yolanda is also a professor of law at Wake Forest Law School, where she lectures on the topic of community lawyering, and she provides her students with real focus and opportunities to learn the methods of community lawyering. She takes her students out into the community to hear what the community has to say. One being an example of a Happy Hill, predominantly African-American community in Winston-Salem, and helping them, listening to them, how they want to devise ways to help protect their property and against gentrification, using community land trust, using historic preservation, getting at the table with developers and local governments. As Yolanda says, if you're not at the table, you're either underneath it or you're on it. Yolanda is also the mother of 2 daughters, Sasha and Chloe, a wife to Eugene Taylor, who we will see shortly. Daughter, she is a legacy of her mother. She is a sister, she's a friend, and I'm very fortunate to consider Yolanda one of my friends. She's made me a better person and a better advocate. On behalf of the Fair Housing Project of Legal Aid, the whole Legal Aid kit and caboodle, the City of Raleigh's Fair Housing Hearing Board, thank you, Yolanda. Thank you for all that you do for our communities, and we're so excited to stop listening to me right now and to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Kelly Clark. I am again honored and almost brought to tears, but honored to have a friend and a colleague like Kelly introduce me to you all this afternoon. As Kelly stated, I'm not a typical lawyer, so this isn't going to be a typical lawyer speech. Therefore, at this time, I would like to introduce you to Eugene Taylor, the Drum Prophet. Eugene and I met when I could afford a law firm at downtown Raleigh, specifically on Hargett Street. I want to say about 14, 15 years ago. We've been married 13 years. Some of you already know, and I guess I just told you, he's my husband, but he's also an amazing artist who has the gift to heal, inspire, and encourage others through the djembe drum. So I would like for Eugene, we've heard a lot of great things today, and some of it could have been, reinforcing trauma, reinforcing, hopelessness, or just imagining the battle that we have ahead. So I want Eugene to use his drum to edify and encourage us and to uplift all of us in this space at this moment. And while he's doing that, I'm gonna tell you where I'm from. I'm from cornfields and tobacco fields, pigs squealing and chickens running around with their heads chopped off. I'm from grandma's fried chicken, admittedly white Jesus on the wall, but black farmland owned by my granddaddy, then farmland taken from my granddaddy by the federal government Vietnam War stories told by my daddy, bought and sometimes sewn clothing stitched by my mama. I'm from South Carolina and Eastern North Carolina barbecue. I am from the valley, but I am also from the peak. I am from what hip hop has named the dirty, dirty South. South Carolina born, North Carolina raised. I am from memories recent and distant. I am from love. I am from love. I'm from love hoped for and later conceived. I'm from hundreds of cousins, family reunions, siblings, but most importantly, I am from home. I am from red line communities, inequitable zoning policies, but yet I am from home. I am from home, although I've lived in several houses. I am from home because I was able to settle and be a part of a family, and then later create a family because I had a home. So when we talk about housing, we aren't simply talking about housing. We're talking about the right for human beings to gather in a safe and private place where memories and family can be created and shared. We're talking about the right of every human being to say they are from home because they were afforded the right to create a home. A home can't be fully realized living on the streets or in a congregated setting, but home is where you feel safe from harm and constant intrusion, where you can create dreams and share laughter. A home is where you can settle until you decide you don't want to settle there anymore. A home shouldn't be taken. A home shouldn't be unavailable. A home should be accessible. And a home should be affordable. For who? To you. A home should be on either side of the tracks. A home should be in downtown, uptown, midtown, north, south, west, and east. A home should be your fair choice in a community that's healthy and vibrant. A home should be a home to whoever wants one or needs one. A home requires housing. Housing is a human right. Thank you, Eugene. Thank you. In 2008, the U.S. Census Bureau announced its projection that by 2042, for the first time in America history, whites would no longer be the majority in a country that had not known of no other configuration, no other way to be. America is becoming browner. Yet, with the browning of America, injustices still exist. It's been more than 400 years of oppression, y'all. Our discussions have resulted in more discourse. They become more divisive. Almost every commentary on social media around housing is triggering almost. Those in power fight to maintain power, and those without power fight to shape America in a new and different way. The election of the first Black president seemed to take us backwards and not forward. I remember the happiness I felt the day after his election. I recall that day traveling down Highway 64 to Wilson when a pickup truck got in front of me with the following letters in all caps, OBAMA, Obama. And in tiny print beside each letter were the following words spelled out, one big ass mistake, America. I felt my balloon of happiness deflate. I was confused. Who are these people? I later came to realize that while this president's election instilled hope and happiness in me, it only instilled anger and fear in others. It unearthed the shaky foundation on which America was built. The rug was suddenly removed from the floor and we saw the dirt, the cobwebs, the broken wooden planks, and the dimming of hope. In Isabel Wickerson's book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, she discusses how although no one alive today are contributors to the original sin of slavery that stain and continues to stain the ideal of America, however, she says we are the heirs to whatever is right or wrong with America. So we're the inheritors or the heirs to what is right or wrong with America, then we're either oppressed by the disparities in the housing system or we benefit from the disparities in the housing system. Housing is a system. And we can't talk fully about a system without understanding who the system benefits and who the system fairly unburdens. As the speakers before me stated, it's time to be bold. It's time to get courageous. It's time to tell the truth. It unfairly burdens low-wealth tenants and disproportionately burdens Black, Indigenous, people of color, and their communities. The race-wealth gap between non-Hispanic whites households and Black households is large and present. Decades of discrimination against Black Americans left a $10.4 trillion racial wealth gap. A $10.4 trillion racial wealth gap. When will the lion be able to tell his story? Currently, the story of the hunt glorifies the hunter, but when the lion tells his story, it would glorify the lion. It is time for a paradigm shift in the way that we talk about housing and the topic of housing, not just in this country, but in our city. Is housing simple a mere commodity to be bought and sold to the highest bidder? Or is it a basic human need, a human right? I say the latter. The system of housing, as we know, was built on injustices and decades of discrimination that have not yet been repaired. Until it's been repaired, there will be no true peace. True peace, as Dr. Martin Luther King stated, isn't merely the absence of tensions, but it is the presence of justice. So until there's justice, housing justice, there will never be true peace in our communities. We are living in a time and a space for such a time as this. It is no coincidence that you all are here today. It's no coincidence that you are alive today, you were born in this generation today, because you are the stewards of what is right and what is wrong in America. All lives matter, sure. That's an unknown normacy, we know that. It's an unspoken truth that all lives matter, but Black lives matter, and we have to say it because we see that a different value is placed on our bodies, not when it just comes to police violence or the way police engage with people of color or Black people, but we see the appraisal industry has biases and prejudices. The mere fact that your Black body lives in a house, you can get a different appraisal result. So I'm calling all of you to be courageous at this point, and if you're an ally, I'm calling you to be an ally and speak up and tell the truth, or be accomplished, as someone that the speaker earlier today stated. But fair housing is still a battle, and so I'm gonna turn to my PowerPoint right now. Why does housing matter? It's already been said 1,000 times today by eloquent speakers and our panelists who actually are on the ground doing this work. It matters because where you live matters. Where you live determines whether or not you have access to health care, access to food, transportation, whether or not you experience violence and crime, whether or not you are experiencing environmental injustices or environmental racism, whether or not you're policed more. You know, it's a host of issues that surround housing. So housing matters. And we know that there was a tremendous fight, and we stand on the shoulders of those who have fought and who have paved the initial path towards housing, but fair housing has not been truly realized yet. We hear that from all of you as you share. And we know that in 1968, after King was assassinated, that Lyndon Johnson immediately encouraged Congress to pass the Fair Housing Act of 1968. But prior to that, let's talk about how King came to realize that open housing and fair housing was needed. Because we can't talk about housing without talking about fair housing and Dr. King's legacy. The term housing choice assumes that there is a level playing field, and I hear that word tossed around a lot. Housing choice, housing choice. What does that mean? You get a house, and you get a house, and we all get a house. But if there are barriers towards accessing housing, how do we all get a house? Again, we can't talk about housing without talking about fair housing. We know that after fighting for voter rights in the South, Dr. Martin Luther King moved to Chicago in 1966, where his family settled down into a rundown apartment on the west side of Chicago. However, in one of his last campaigns before he died, Dr. King joined residents in their fight against unfair housing practices. This advocacy campaign was dubbed the Chicago Freedom Movement, and it contributed to the passage, again, of the monumental 1968 Federal Fair Housing Act. Okay. So, and we've talked a little bit about this term, affirmatively furthering fair housing, and what does affirmatively fair housing means. As I stated earlier, affirmatively fair housing basically means that it's the fight to enforce fair housing. It's the end goal of what King fought for. He saw that even though voting rights was a civil rights issue, the denial of economic mobility was one as well. And that this was not just a race thing, it's also a class thing. We know that. But the Fair Housing Act prohibits, among other things, discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing of dwellings. We talked about that. We know it extends beyond that, and it extends beyond the individual protected groups of gender, religion, color, nationality, sex, am I forgetting something? Nationality, I may be leaving some out, I'm trying to think, but you know, the protective groups. But it goes beyond that. But it also requires the city of Raleigh and other cities and jurisdictions that are receiving HUD funds to affirmatively further fair housing. How do you affirmatively further in it? Is it being affirmatively further? That's something you have to ask yourself. Is it being affirmatively further wherever you live from? I know this is a Raleigh Fair Housing Conference, but I've met people from Concord today and from across the state. So what does it mean to actually describe the housing barrier, describe the housing discrimination, and then remove it? So we're going to talk about that as well, because that's what affirmatively furthering fair housing is. And we also know, and I'm sorry I'm using this, okay, when we talk about fair housing enforcement, you know, some of the guests here today have talked about the need to equip the Fair Housing Hearing Board with subpoena powers and enforcement powers. But on the federal level, HUD in 2015 attempted to add more teeth to the affirmatively furthering fair housing requirement that's actually embedded in the actual act. By requiring grantees to submit a new document. So instead of being able to submit an analysis of impediment to fair housing, under the Obama administration, they determined that the prior means of enforcement were not reliable because there was no way to verify compliance with the affirmatively furthering fair housing mandate. Jurisdictions didn't even have to submit their analysis of impediments to fair housing choice. But in 2015, the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule established a process by which grantees like the city had to conduct a more extensive analysis of local fair housing concerns, and instead of it being an analysis of impediments to fair housing choice, this rule renamed it, and it was called the assessment of fair housing, which told jurisdictions like Raleigh and other cities and counties that they had to commit to certain specific steps to remedy fair housing issues. And that not only that they had to do that, they had to submit this plan for HUD review. So in 2015, as stated, I was a lawyer or a managing attorney in the Wilson office, and I began to work with a group called the Steering Committee of the Community Academy. And then later, I remember I hired Peter Gilbert. I don't know if he's still here, but he came to work with me in Wilson, and we began to do what I call community lawyering in support of a community movement. So coincidentally, a year or so later, the city of Rocky Mount began its fair housing planning process. And so it created its 2018. This was the first time, the assessment of fair housing had to be used. I remember calling Jeff, like, Jeff, do you have a framework? Do you have a sample? Is there something I can look at as I help, these clients advocate for fair housing rights and to put their comments and their voice, have that incorporated into this HUD document. So they created their 2018 assessment of fair housing. But a great thing about this new rule that came about in 2015 was that it required meaningful community engagement. So I really put a hook in that term meaningful, because we know that we show up sometimes. We don't know if our voices are being incorporated into the decisions. We don't know if we're talking to a wall. We don't know if the decisions have already been made, because what I've learned as a community lawyer is that sometimes when you show up to the meeting, there was a meeting before the meeting. We know that. And so the submission of Rocky Mount's 2018 assessment fair housing document was definitely embedded with meaningful community engagement, because I made sure of it, and Peter, who was with me, he made sure of it as well. But we spent months just educating the Community Academy on its rights under, one, the Fair Housing Act, the State Fair Housing Act, and also on this document, the 2018 Assessment of Fair Housing Doc. Okay, and just to let you know, because this rule is no longer the rule, I'm gonna talk about the new published 2023 affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, but I want to compare like that rule and the new rule that we have today. So that rule actually, and I love the framework because it had an assessment of fair housing tool. Now, I loved it because I'm an outside advocate. I don't think cities and their staff loved it, because I think it was a 100-page document, or it had 100 questions that they had to answer. But this is a sample from the Rocky Mount's 2018 Assessment of Fair Housing. I liked it because it lists all the contributing factors to a fair housing issue. So do you know that the location and the type of affordable housing could be a contributing factor of a fair housing issue? Well, that was embedded, in this document. So the city of Rocky Mount, the consultants who prepared this assessment of fair housing doc for them, said that this needed to be a high priority, because you want to make sure that you locate affordable housing in every community, pretty much, especially communities of opportunity. Communities of opportunity are communities that have great schools, that have access to jobs, access to health care, food. It's not a food apartheid district or a food desert zone. So it talked about that. And the reason why I like this, because it helped me to really understand more about affirmatively furthering fair housing. Okay. And here's another shot too. It stated that deterioration and abandoned property, land use and zoning laws, the lack of private investment in specific neighborhoods is a contributing factor to a fair housing issue. So when we think about the communities that are now gentrifying, before that, decades, there was this fair housing issue because they were, left abandoned, they were deteriorated, and we know that the residents that lived and were locked into these all-Black neighborhoods because of redlining and housing prejudices and discrimination, we know that they didn't create these slum areas. We know that it was intentionally designed and done by local policy, or the intentional dismissal and ignoring these communities. So these communities, so in this document here, in Rocky Mount at that time, that was a high priority, the deterioration and abandoned properties. In fact, we represented 13 underserved communities who had abandoned and vacant property in their neighborhoods. And we also know that land use and zoning laws are a contributing factor to a fair housing issue. It depends on what zoning laws are in place. If there are exclusionary zoning laws that keep people from being able to enter into other communities of opportunity because of, I don't know, policies or, the prejudices of people who live in these high opportunity neighborhoods, that could be an issue. So we are seeing now, as cities try to undo the harmful past, they're now creating zoning laws which seem good on its face, all types of affordable housing, types that's needed because everyone doesn't want to live in a single family house, that's for sure. People want to live in apartments, some people want to live in condos, some people want to live in townhomes. There should be all types of affordable housing types, and not just for single people, but for families, and not just for families, for people with disabilities, and for people, if you're talking about a family, there are some protections against discriminating against people who have, more than 2 kids, if it's a large family. So all these various housing types should be present in community, and they should be located in communities of opportunity. And again, it's stated that the lack of private investment in these communities was a contributing factor to a fair housing issue. So, and to recap the 2015 rule, the assessment of fair housing, it also had metrics and milestones and timelines for addressing each contributing issue to a fair housing issue. So being at the table with the Community Academy, we were on top of the City of Rocky Mount. Okay, now, you say you were gonna do this in a year. Okay, now, you say you were gonna do this in 2 years. Okay, now, it's 3 years, and this is what your metric for this particular goal. When is this gonna get done? But in the summer of 2020, the Trump administration replaced the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule with a rule called preserving neighborhood and community choice without even going through the required notice and comment process, right? I mean, that's a requirement. If you're gonna put out a proposed rule, give people opportunity to comment and incorporate thoughts. But this rule not only rescinded the 2015 affirmatively furthering fair housing rule and an assessment of fair housing doc that I love so much, but it also redefined the term fair housing. How are you gonna change the definition of fair housing? But it did. As well as the Fair Housing Act, the affirmatively furthering fair housing obligation to eliminate much of HUD's grantees' responsibility. So basically, they just gutted the rule. And jurisdictions, their responsibility became no more. And that was in 2020. So what I want to say is, as we talk about fair housing, you can't fix a problem until you see it. A lot of us see it in this room, but we know there are a lot of people that we work with that, that are in our community that just don't see it. So what we need to think about, as we leave this space is how do we make what's invisible visible? How do we make these structural, systemic issues visible? Well, the Trump administration was making it visible, because why would that be one of the first things you do when you take office, which is to attack the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule? So, and this is something that Trump stated on Twitter to scare the heck out of people living in the suburbs. He stated that people living their suburban lifestyle dream would no longer be bothered or financially hurt by having low-income housing built in your neighborhood. The president was referring to the administration's decision to roll back the Obama-era 2015 affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. And as I stated, the rule promulgated under Obama, his administration at HUD, was indeed meant to combat racial segregation in suburban housing. But the program expanded the provisions as we talked about. But this is what Trump has stated, former President Trump has stated regarding the fear of low-income housing. He says your housing prices now, because I got rid of all of that, will now go up based on the market and crime will go down, he wrote, even though there was no evidence that the program led to an increase in crime. There was no evidence that giving people fair housing choice and undoing decades of housing discrimination led to an increased time. But we know all people need is fear. Fear will make you do crazy things. But in 2019, and it took a while for the current administration to really propose their final rule. They took baby steps, but on January 19, 2023, a new affirmatively furthering fair housing rule was released, and this rule, Biden promises, will restore a rule and will require cities, counties, and states that receive the federal housing funds that we discussed earlier to examine patterns of residential segregation within their borders. So if you're living in a city or a town or a county that receives these federal housing funds, under this new rule, they have to examine the patterns of racial segregation. So a lot of people think gentrification is integration. How's it integration when there's mass displacement? All you're doing is moving segregation somewhere else. All you're doing is moving concentrated areas of poverty in another locality if there's mass displacement. The new Biden rule does resemble a little bit the affirmatively furthering fair housing guidance that was established in 2015, but this is a new version, and it establishes a more streamlined process because remember the assessment of fair housing document was required to be submitted. Well, this is very burdensome to HUD. It was burdensome, the 100 questions that you had to answer. It was a little burdensome to cities and localities. So it's more streamlined. But what they're asking communities to do now is to submit what's called an equity plan. So officials also believe that this framework will be easier for localities of different sizes, and it will allow them to be able to do this work, and it will also be harder for them to ignore, because some people were ignoring it and complaining that the previous rule made things too burdensome. But now they do have to submit an equity plan. So, Trump was harping about the suburbs, but when you look at the data and you look at what's occurring, let's say right here in Raleigh, diversity is fleeing the city, and diversity is actually, increasing in the suburbs. And this was from the article in the New York Times on Raleigh and the gentrification issue. It was titled, "This neighborhood is mostly Black, the home buyers are mostly white." And this map here, basically, if you see the almost peach color there in the middle, that's where the white population grew. And everything in blue is where the non-white population grew. So as you can see, in a core center city is where, the white population is growing. And we see that, non-white populations are actually growing in the suburbs. And in that same article in the New York Times, there was a quote by, she was the former executive director of the Southeast Raleigh Promise, Kia Baker. But before that, it says in neighborhoods, let's say like South Park here in Raleigh, white residents are changing not only the racial mix of the community, they're also altering the economic estate beneath everyone. So, so King's idea was that there would be integration. And integration means you get to stay, right? I don't think he could have ever dreamed of a time where someone will all of a sudden, when you think about those racist maps that designated and redline communities as undesirable, that these same communities will one day become desirable. I personally think the 2023 rule needs to go further. I think there needs to be a clear way to sue for justification. Kelly and I, we're working on that right. Once pulling Kelly into stuff. We got to figure out a way to do that. But yeah, so I don't think King could have ever imagined that one day people would want to come live in a downtown area that was depleted, had no amenities, was predominantly Black, and had no other resources. But Kia Baker stated, "That's what finally came to me. It's not just the fact that the neighborhoods are different or look different, that people behave differently," say Kia E. Baker, who grew up in Southeast Raleigh and now, and at that time, she was directing Southeast Raleigh Promise. So some of that change, she said, could be positive. This realization was not our Black bodies literally having less economic value than the body of white people or a white person. As soon as a white body moves into the same space that I occupied, all of a sudden this place has more value, or it's more valuable. What's up with that? It's more valuable. All of a sudden, the businesses want to come. All of a sudden, the amenities want to come. But when it was just Black, there were no amenities. So arguably, those were not communities of opportunity. And as stated earlier, those were serious, glaring, fair housing issues that needed to be addressed, and still do. Okay, I'm almost done. The housing crisis. We know we're in a housing crisis. We talk about it a lot. But I just wanted to say here that, we know that Wake County reported recently there are 20 homeless camps. One was just removed by the Department of Transportation on Capitol Boulevard, but 20 encampments? So we're seeing how the homelessness is going up. And I believe in 2001, it was reported, Wake County experienced an increase in homelessness at 67% from 2001. So there was a 67% increase in homelessness since 2001. And nationally, nearly a quarter of Black renters were behind on their rent in the third quarter of 2021. And I got the opportunity to work with Apryl Lewis and the amazing work that she's doing around tenant organizing, and we've had webinars, and we've done it all to talk about how Black women with children were at the crossroads of this eviction crisis that happened before the pandemic and was exacerbated because of the pandemic. We wrote policy documents to the governor saying you can't displace people because in order to stay at home, you need a home. That was our hashtag. In order to stay at home, you need a home. So we were writing letters to the Utilities Commission, to the governor's office. We were doing all of that. So, but this new proposed 2023 Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule requires public engagement again, but this time the public will actually be able to submit information directly to HUD if you have a complaint or you have concerns regarding the equity plan that's submitted by your city or your local jurisdiction. Also, the public will be able to, file complaints directly with HUD regarding a program participants' related activities, and this in turn will enable HUD to then open a compliance review in response to a complaint. HUD also eliminated one particular provision of the 2015 rule that called for an analysis of contributing factors. So there go all my analysis of contributing factors that I love. That has been eliminated, but it's in my mind. And I think those are still fair housing violations. And I will still make an argument based on those contributing factors. And again, the 2023 Affirmative Further Fair Housing Rule, remember the Trump administration changed the definition or got rid of the definition, did something like that. There's a definition here. How am I on time? Am I doing okay with time? I don't know, keeping up with the time. But fair housing issues mean it's a condition in the city's participants' geographic area of the analysis that restrict fair housing choice or access to opportunity and community assets. Examples of such conditions that could be a fair housing issue could be ongoing local or regional segregation. So is there ongoing local and regional segregation going on in your community, or a lack of integration? Gentrification is a lack of integration. Are they still racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty? A significant disparities in access to opportunity. We're seeing this with the housing crisis. Are there significant, she said I'm done, I can read that. I'm almost done, okay, let me hear. Where do we go from here? Can I have a little grace? Oh my God. Where do we go from here? Because I do want to talk about that. Where do we go from here? I like solutions. So get familiar with the consolidation plan in Raleigh. It's a 2021 through 2025 consolidation plan. It talks about how the developers are the ones displacing people. It's just the developers. We're not doing anything. Is that affirmatively furthering fair housing when you just blame it on the developers? Understand the priorities in that consolidation plan. There were like 3 of them there. Are they meeting those priorities? But some of the strategies, and they have to put strategies in that consolidation plan too. So look at their strategies. Are they creating affordable housing? Are they doing the things that they say they will do? What is their performance like? We need to be able to measure and enforce compliance with what they stated to HUD they would do. But some equitable strategies I want to share before I leave is that I think we have to build racial justice equity in land use decisions. I know I've tweeted to some council people about why don't you require a racial justice impact statement on every development, proposed rezoning request. A lot of times, we have environmental justice statements, or how it's going to impact transit or traffic, or how it's going to, impact an environment issue like a creek or flooding. So we need to also require, that there be a racial equity analysis or impact statement that will talk about the impact that this proposed development will have on historically BIPOC communities or low wealth communities. I hope we can share this out. And I just talked about how Wake Forest has, they talk about, racial inequities in their affordable housing plan. So I'm gonna go from there. Where am I now? Yeah, this is Happy Hill neighborhood that I work with in Winston-Salem. They've been able to preserve their culture, history. I know with gentrification, it's not just the displacement of people, it's the displacement of culture, history, service industries, churches, the whole gamut. I'm gonna skip through the social housing. That's real radical, but I think there should be social housing. If we're talking about housing as a human right, maybe we should create social housing zones. Of course, we know that that will take funding and maybe subsidies to do that, but because the market is not producing the housing that's needed for low-income people. Again, housing is a human right. International law recognizes it as a human right. We need to push, at least locally, that it be recognized here. I mean, the city councils where you live at could pass a resolution. Some cities have passed resolutions around reparations. There could be a resolution passed by the city council that housing is a human right. And that could be their policy that they center development decisions on. And we need to have meaningful discussions around reparative justice, because I hear a lot of people say how land was actually taken from them. And this is the last one here. Oops. Well, this, there is, if you Google it, Google the word dignity taken. There's a professor of law that's at, what law school is she at? She talks about a dignity taken. She talks about what happened during the apartheid in Africa, how land was taken, and how a Land Restoration Act was passed. But this is my last slide here. So when we speak of housing, America is like an old house. If you've ever purchased an old house, then you know the work is never done, and you don't expect it to be. America is an old house. We can never expect the work to be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Yolanda. Today has been an incredible and inspiring way to close out Fair Housing Month and commemorate the 55th anniversary of the passage of the Federal Fair Housing Act. This concludes our program, but before I do, I just want to thank everyone who made this event possible today, the panelists, our moderator, the Raleigh Fair Housing Hearing Board, the City of Raleigh, and its Department of Equity and Inclusion. Without Demetrius and Arcelis, today's event would not have happened without them, so thank you so much. And we would really like to thank all of you for being here today and the work that you do in your personal lives and in your professional lives in affirmatively furthering fair housing and in furtherance of equal housing opportunities. We look forward to future events and opportunities to engage and to continue to push forward. Thank you all for being here today, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Thank you. Oh. There is an evaluation form on your table. If you could please complete that, we'll go around and collect them. Thank you so much.